Hey friends! Glad you're here at Arcane Paradox. We've cooked up something special. Goblin ritual detected 44 personality fractures on Harry and ancient treaty voided Britain wards. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Ritual. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry always thought was the least magical day of the week. It wasn't delivered by owl. That was the first strange thing. It came through the Dursleys' mail slot at precisely 7 in the morning, sliding through with a sound like a blade being drawn, and it landed face up on the hallway floor with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested it had not so much been posted as aimed. The envelope was made of something that wasn't quite paper, thicker, with a faint iridescent sheen, the color of old bronze left in the rain. The seal on the back was pressed deep into black wax, a key crossed with a battle-axe, the Gringotts mark, but rendered in a style Harry had never seen on any of their standard correspondence. Older. More serious. Harry picked it up. He was the only one awake. Uncle Vernon's snoring was still rattling through the ceiling of number 4, Privet Drive, and Dudley wouldn't surface until there was food involved. The house smelled like it always did, carpet cleaner and the ghost of last night's roast, and the morning light through the frosted glass of the front door was the flat, gray kind that made everything look like a photograph of itself. He turned the envelope over. His name was on the front, written not in ink but in something that looked like it had been pressed into the material itself, the letters slightly raised, as though the envelope remembered being written on. Harry James Potter. Current residence, 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Temporary domicile only. That last part stung a little. Even his mail knew he didn't belong here. He broke the seal. The letter inside was short. That surprised him too. He'd expected something lengthy and formal, the kind of document that buried its meaning under layers of legal language designed to make the reader feel slightly stupid. Instead there were 4 lines, written in the same impressed style as his name on the envelope. Mr. Potter, you are required to present yourself at Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley, London, no later than 9 o'clock in the morning on the 14th of July. This is not a request. The instrument compelling your attendance was signed by your magical guardian on the 21st of October, 1981, and has been in legal effect since that date. Failure to appear will result in enforcement measures as described in Clause 7 of the Goblin Wizard Treaty of 872 AD. Director Ragnok. Harry read it twice. Then he sat down on the bottom stair, still in his pajamas, and read it a third time. The 21st of October, 1981. 10 days before his parents died. Someone had signed a legal document committing him to appear at Gringotts on a date to be determined, when he was 1 year old and presumably not doing much beyond existing loudly and needing his nappy changed. The word guardian did a lot of work in that sentence, and Harry noticed immediately that it didn't say parent. It said guardian. Which meant it wasn't his mom or dad. He sat with that for a moment. The snoring upstairs continued. A car went past on the road outside. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and then thought better of it. Harry went upstairs, got dressed, and was out the door before 7:30. He didn't leave a note. Diagon Alley was quiet at that hour on a weekday in July. The shops weren't open yet, Ollivander's was shuttered, Flourish and Blots had its curtains drawn, and even the leaky cauldron felt like it was still deciding whether to be awake. Harry had taken the night bus without any particular enthusiasm, enduring Stan Shunpike's cheerful commentary and 3 sharp corners that nearly launched him through a window, and arrived at the leaky cauldron with 20 minutes to spare. He tapped through the wall into the alley itself and walked straight to Gringotts. The bank looked the same as always, white marble, enormous bronze doors, the smaller silver doors inside, the goblin guards with their expressions of polite and comprehensive contempt for everyone who wasn't carrying enough gold to be interesting. But when Harry pushed through the doors and approached the nearest desk, the goblin behind it looked up with an expression that wasn't contempt. It was something Harry needed a second to identify. Expectation. The goblin was expecting him specifically, and found his arrival significant. Harry Potter, the goblin said. Not a question. Yeah. You have a 9 o'clock. I know. I'm early. The goblin studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable, then slid off its stool. Follow me. This was different too. Usually when Harry came to Gringotts it was to access his vault, which meant a different goblin every time, a cart, the long rattling descent into the earth, the smell of stone and old magic and gold that had been sitting untouched long enough to develop opinions. This goblin didn't take him toward the carts. It led him instead to a door at the back of the main hall, a door Harry had walked past a dozen times and never really registered, the way you don't register things that your brain has quietly decided aren't meant for you. It was tall and narrow and made of something darker than wood, with hinges that looked like they'd been cast from iron in a furnace that had opinions about what it was making. The goblin knocked twice. The door opened inward without anyone visible opening it. Director Ragnok will see you, the goblin said, and stepped aside. Harry went in. The room was nothing like what Harry would have expected, which was probably the point. He'd imagined something vault-like, stone, severe, built to impress through scale and weight. Instead it was smaller than the Gryffindor common room, with a ceiling low enough that a tall wizard would have felt it and lined on 3 sides with shelves of a kind Harry had never seen before. Not bookshelves exactly, the things on them weren't just books. There were objects, small iron keys and carved stones and what looked like folded pieces of very old cloth sealed inside glass cases, and scrolls bound with cord that had gone dark with age, and in one corner something that moved very slowly that Harry deliberately didn't look at for too long. The desk in the center of the room was huge relative to the goblin sitting behind it, which meant Ragnok had either chosen it to make a point or simply didn't care about proportion. He was old, Harry could see that immediately, though he had no framework for goblin aging. His face had the quality of old leather that has been through a great deal of weather and come out tougher for it. His eyes were a very dark amber, the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and they fixed on Harry with an attention so complete it felt almost physical. Sit, Ragnok said. Harry sat. The chair was sized for a wizard, which meant the goblins had been expecting him specifically and prepared for him, which meant this meeting had been planned long enough in advance that someone had thought about chair dimensions. That detail, for some reason, was the one that made Harry's stomach tighten. You read the letter, Ragnok said. 3 times. Good. Most humans read things like that once and then come in here ready to argue about whether it's legally binding. Ragnok's tone made it clear what he thought of that approach. The instrument is legally binding. It has been legally binding since 1981. The question of who signed it and what authority they held to do so is a separate question, and one that this institution has spent considerable resources investigating over the past several months. Harry kept his face still. What kind of ritual? An inheritance ritual. Specifically, a lineage and legacy assessment, one of the oldest and most comprehensive diagnostic procedures in goblin magical practice. It has not been performed on a living wizard in approximately 312 years. Ragnok paused. The last time it was performed, the results were also unusual. What happened then? A war. Ragnok said it simply, without drama, the way someone might say a rainstorm. But that is historical context. Let us focus on you, Mr. Potter. He folded his hands on the desk, small hands, gray-skinned, with fingers that were longer than they looked like they should be. Do you know what a magical fracture is? No. Most wizards don't. It is not something that happens naturally. Ragnok's voice didn't change, but something in it went very precise. A magical fracture occurs when a portion of a person's magical core and the identity that shapes it is deliberately separated from the rest. Sealed off. Hidden. The remaining self continues to function, often normally, from the outside, but it is incomplete. Like a book with chapters removed. The story still makes a kind of sense if you haven't read the original, but there are gaps. Moments where the narrative doesn't quite hold together. Harry thought about every time he'd had a feeling he couldn't name, an instinct that seemed to belong to someone else, a flash of something, grief, or rage, or a kind of knowing, that didn't connect to any memory he could point to. How many fractures? He asked. Ragnok looked at him steadily. We discovered the first indicators 3 months ago, when we began our investigation into the instrument. We confirmed the full count last week. He picked up a document from his desk and laid it flat. 44. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Harry stared at him. 44. 44 distinct fractures. 44 sealed portions of your magical core and the identity structures attached to them. Ragnok's amber eyes didn't waver. To be clear about the scale of what I am telling you, a single magical fracture, deliberately induced, is considered an act of profound violation under Goblin law. It is, in fact, the reason we have laws about it at all. 2 fractures in a single individual has occurred perhaps a dozen times in recorded Goblin history, always under circumstances that later proved catastrophic. The highest number ever previously recorded, he paused, was 7. Harry said nothing. He wasn't sure he could. 44 fractures means that the person sitting in front of me is operating with a fraction of his complete self, Ragnok continued. The person you know yourself to be, Mr. Potter, your memories, your magical instincts, your personality, your knowledge, your power, is the portion that was left after 44 removals. He let that sit for exactly long enough. You are, by our best estimate, experiencing approximately 40 to 45% of your full capability. The shelves along the walls felt very close suddenly. The room hadn't changed size, but Harry's sense of it had shifted. Who did it? He said. His voice came out quieter than he intended but steadier than he expected. We will come to that. First, I need your consent to proceed with the ritual. It is your choice entirely. The instrument compels your presence, it does not compel your participation. You may leave this room right now, go back to that house in Surrey, and live the rest of your life at 40-odd%. Ragnok's tone was absolutely neutral. Or you can let us perform the ritual and find out who you actually are. Harry looked at the door. He looked at Ragnok. He thought about the letter, and the words temporary domicile only, and the feeling he'd had his entire life of being slightly behind himself, slightly out of step with some version of who he was supposed to be. Let's do it, he said. The ritual chamber was underground. Of course it was. Goblins understood that the most serious magic happened below the surface, where the earth was oldest and the ambient noise of the human world couldn't interfere. Harry followed Ragnok through a corridor that descended gradually for long enough that he lost track of how deep they were, the temperature dropping steadily until his breath just barely showed, and then they came through an archway into a space that stopped him mid-step. It was circular, maybe 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling carved from a single piece of dark stone, no seams, no joins, as though the room had been grown rather than built. The floor was covered in markings that Harry had to look at sideways before his eyes would accept what they were seeing, symbols layered under symbols, some scratched and some pressed and some that seemed to exist slightly below the surface of the stone, as though they'd been carved into the rock while it was still liquid. In the center of the floor was a raised dais, circular, about the size of a kitchen table, and on it was a basin, not unlike the pensieve in Dumbledore's office, but made of black iron instead of stone, and filled with something that wasn't water. It moved with more intention than water. It swirled slowly in a direction that didn't entirely correspond to any of the 3 dimensions Harry was most comfortable with. Around the edges of the room stood 6 goblins Harry hadn't seen before. They were in robes that made Ragnok's formal attire look casual, layered things, deep charcoal and bronze, covered in the same kind of symbols as the floor. They were all very still and very focused, and not one of them looked at Harry the way most goblins looked at wizards. They looked at him the way you might look at something very valuable that had been damaged. Remove your shoes, Ragnok said, and step onto the dais. Harry kicked his trainers off, left his socks on, and stepped up. The dais was warm under his feet through the socks. The markings on the floor pulsed once, not visibly, exactly, but Harry felt it in his chest the way you feel a bass note through a wall. Place your hands in the basin, Ragnok said. Palms down. Don't fight whatever you feel. What am I going to feel? Pressure, Ragnok said. And then possibly a great deal more than pressure. I would advise you not to panic. That's very reassuring. Something that was almost a smile moved across Ragnok's face. I have been told I need to work on my bedside manner. Harry put his hands in the basin. The substance in it was cool against his palms, much cooler than the dais, cooler than the air, and had a texture that wasn't quite liquid, more like the memory of liquid, the ghost of water in a container that had held water for centuries. He felt it move against his hands, and then he felt it identify him, which was the only word his brain reached for, the sense that whatever was in the basin was doing something far more thorough than simply touching him. It was reading him. Layer by layer, the way you might page through a book that was also a map that was also a living thing. The 6 robed goblins began to speak. Not in English, not in anything Harry had ever heard, a language that felt like it predated language, that seemed to bypass the part of his brain that processed words and go straight to the part that processed meaning. He felt it in his teeth. He felt it in the space behind his eyes. Then the pressure began. It started in his hands, where they touched the substance in the basin, a weight, pushing up, as though something beneath the surface was pressing against his palms. Not painful. More like being pushed against by a current, a river that had opinions about direction. The weight spread up his arms, into his chest, and Harry understood without being told that what was pressing against him from inside was the ritual finding the fractures, locating each sealed portion the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, precisely and without comfort. He kept his hands still. The first fracture opened. There was no dramatic visual effect, no light, no explosion, no Hollywood moment of a memory erupting into the air. It was quieter than that and more devastating. It was the feeling of a door opening that you'd stood in front of your whole life without knowing it was a door. On the other side of it was something that had been his and that he hadn't been allowed to have, and what came through first was not a memory but an emotion, not sadness, not anger, but something that preceded both those things, a wordless recognition of loss that hit him like stepping off the bottom stair in the dark when you'd miscounted the steps. He made a sound he wasn't proud of. "Keep your hands in the basin," Ragnok said, steady as stone. Harry kept his hands in the basin. The second fracture was different. It came with a memory attached, brief, formless, more sensation than image, the smell of a particular kind of wood smoke, warm arms around him, a voice that wasn't his mother's and wasn't his father's but was someone who had loved him with the complete and uncomplicated conviction that infants inspire in people who have the capacity for it. Gone before he could hold on to it. The loss of it, the sealing of that memory, had been clean and surgical, the way you'd remove a splinter, quick, professional, designed to leave the minimum visible trace. He kept his hands in the basin. The third fracture brought something else entirely, not a memory but a knowing. An instinct that slid into place like a key turning, and Harry suddenly understood, without being told, exactly what a basilisk's venom did to a magical core and why he'd survived it, and the knowledge carried with it a lateral awareness of magic, not just his own but the ambient kind, the background radiation of the old stone and the ancient symbols on the floor and the 6 goblins speaking their older-than-language words, that he hadn't had 30 seconds ago. He looked up at the ceiling. He could see the magic in the stone. "Ragnok," he said. "I know," Ragnok said. "Keep going." By the 10th fracture, Harry had stopped trying to process each one individually. They came faster now, overlapping, a tide rather than individual waves, memories, instincts, bits of knowledge, fragments of personality that slotted back into him with the click of things returning to their proper places. He felt himself getting larger, and he didn't mean physically, though the dais did seem slightly lower than it had a few minutes ago. He meant inwardly. The person he'd been that morning at number 4, Privet Drive, reading a letter in his pajamas and feeling faintly out of step with himself, that person was still there, was the foundation, but there were rooms opening off the foundation now that he hadn't known existed. By the 20th fracture, one of the 6 robed goblins had stopped speaking and was staring at Harry with an expression that was not professional composure. By the 30th, 2 more had stopped. The ritual continued regardless, the language seemed to be sustaining itself now, echoing in the stone, as though the room itself had joined in. At fracture 37, Harry felt something that stopped him entirely for 3 full seconds, though his hands didn't move. It was rage. Not his standard issue adolescent anger, the hot and immediate kind he'd been running on all summer, the helpless fury of being kept in the dark and managed and protected from information like something fragile and stupid. This was older than that and colder than that, a rage that had been sealed away before he was old enough to form words, that had been growing quietly in its sealed space for 15 years, that understood exactly what had been done to it and to him and had very specific opinions about it. It was not the rage of a boy. It was the rage of someone who had been taken apart piece by people who claimed to love him, and it was the quietest and most precise emotion Harry had ever felt. He breathed out slowly. 38, Ragnok said quietly, watching him. I know, Harry said. I can feel them. The last 6 came quickly, not explosively, but with a kind of inevitability, a sequence completing itself. 42. 43. And then 44, which was the longest and the deepest and felt like breaking the surface of water after being held under for a very long time, not dramatic, not triumphant, just the enormous relief of air, of being able to breathe all the way down. Harry lifted his hands from the basin. The chamber went completely silent. The echo of the ancient language faded from the stone. The 6 robed goblins were all staring at him now, composure entirely abandoned, and even Ragnok, who Harry was already beginning to understand was not a goblin who abandoned composure easily, was looking at him with an expression that had moved beyond expectation into something rawer and more complicated. Harry stepped off the dais. His feet on the stone floor felt different, not physically, but in the information they gave him, the sense of the room through the floor, the depth of the earth below. He straightened up. He felt the same. He also felt nothing like himself, or rather, he felt exactly like himself for the first time, which was such a profound distinction that he had to stand still for a moment to let his understanding catch up. Well, he said. Indeed, said Ragnok. 44. 44. Ragnok moved to a small table at the edge of the room that Harry hadn't noticed before, picked up a document. The ritual has recorded each fracture, when it was created, the magical signature of the person who created it, and in several cases, the stated justification noted in surrounding magical residue. He looked up. You will want to sit down for this part. I'm fine standing. Ragnok looked at him for a moment, reading something in Harry's face, and seemed to decide to accept this. As you wish. He looked down at the document. The fractures were created over a period of approximately 3 years, from shortly before your birth until you were 14 months old. The majority were performed in a single extended session on the 23rd of October, 1981. He paused. 2 days after the instrument compelling your presence here today was signed. 2 days after someone committed me to this ritual without my knowledge. Correct. Which means they knew what the ritual would find. Ragnok looked at him with the amber eyes and something in them that was the goblin equivalent of profound respect. You are faster than most, he said. Yes. Whoever signed the instrument did so knowing it would eventually compel you to submit to the ritual. Knowing the ritual would detect and reverse the fractures. The instrument was, in effect, a failsafe. A dead man's switch, if you prefer the Muggle term. They wanted me to get my pieces back. Eventually, yes. When they believed the time was right. Ragnok set the document down. That is the charitable interpretation. The instrument is real. The intent appears genuine. What is less charitable is everything that was done in the years between. The magical signature, Harry said. The person who created the fractures. You said you can identify them. We can. Ragnok's voice went very flat. The signature is consistent across all 44 fractures, with minor variations consistent with fatigue over an extended working. There is no ambiguity. Tell me. Ragnok met his eyes. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The name in the room. Harry didn't move. He didn't flinch, which surprised him, and then didn't, because the rage he'd gotten back at Fracture 37 had already known, had been waiting with its cold certainty, had been building its case in the sealed dark for 15 years. All 44, Harry said. All 44. And the instrument. The one that brought me here. Who signed it? Ragnok was quiet for exactly long enough that Harry understood this was going to be the harder answer. The signature on the instrument is Sirius Orion Black. The room moved slightly, or Harry's relationship to the room moved, a shift, a catch, a moment of complete stillness that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the size of that information. Sirius. Who had been in Azkaban since Harry was 15 months old. Who had been put there, everyone believed, because of what he'd done. Who had apparently, before all of that, signed a legal Goblin instrument to make sure Harry could one day get back what Dumbledore had taken. Harry put his hand on the edge of the table beside him. Not for support, exactly. More for the realness of it, the cold iron edge of something that existed solidly in the physical world while his internal world did what it needed to do. There's more, he said. He could feel it in how Ragnok was holding himself. There is. Ragnok picked up a second document. The instrument that Sirius Black signed contains a clause, standard in Goblin legal instruments of this period, included automatically whenever a ritual of this type is commissioned, which specifies that if the ritual is triggered and the fractures confirmed, and if the fractures are found to have been created by a party acting in bad faith toward the instrument's subject, Ragnok looked up. Then the legal basis of the Goblin-Wizard Treaty of 872 AD is considered void. Harry stared at him. The entire treaty. The entire treaty. What does that mean, practically? Ragnok set the document down with the care of someone handling something both very important and very volatile. The Treaty of 872 is the legal and magical foundation of nearly every ward, boundary stone, protective marking, and magical infrastructure element currently operating in Britain. The Ministry's wards on Hogwarts, the Fidelius Charm Network, the Blood Wards, he paused very deliberately, the Blood Wards on your aunt's house, which are maintained by Goblin magic running on treaty authority. Every ward that relies on the treaty's provisions for its legal validity and magical continuity. He met Harry's eyes. At midnight tonight, unless the treaty is renegotiated or the void clause challenged through channels that no longer exist, those wards will begin to fail. The silence in the chamber was enormous. All of them, Harry said. All of them. Harry looked at the basin on the dais. He looked at the symbols on the floor. He looked at Ragnok, who was watching him with the expression of someone who has just lit a very large and carefully planned fire and is watching to see whether the person standing near it will run or stay. Harry didn't run. He pulled the chair from the table he'd been leaning against and sat down, not because he needed to but because this next part deserved to be approached properly. Right, he said. Then we'd better figure out what we're going to do about that. Ragnok sat down across from him. And for the first time in what Harry would later come to understand was a very long time, someone in a position of authority sat across from Harry Potter, not to manage him, not to protect him, not to shape him into something useful, but to treat him as an equal with a problem they were going to solve together. Outside, in the London streets above them, it was an ordinary Tuesday morning. The world had not yet noticed that everything was about to change. But in a chamber under Gringotts Bank, carved from stone that remembered what Britain had been before wizards built their careful structures over it, Harry Potter sat across from the director of the most powerful financial and legal institution in the magical world and felt, for the first time, the full weight of himself. It was more than he'd expected. It was exactly what he'd needed. Ragnok picked up a fresh document and a quill. Let us begin, he said. They worked for 4 hours. Ragnok talked and Harry listened, and then Harry started asking questions, and Ragnok's responses to the questions kept developing the particular quality of controlled approval that Harry was beginning to recognize as the Goblin's version of being impressed. They went through the documents, the instrument, the ritual's full findings record, a 300-page analysis of the fracture's creation that Gringotts' team of ritual specialists had produced over the preceding months, and by the time the afternoon pressed against the edges of the morning, Harry had a picture that was both cleaner and uglier than he'd walked in expecting. Dumbledore had started the fractures before Harry's birth. 3 of the 44 predated October 1981, created during a visit Dumbledore had paid to the Potters in late summer of that year under the pretense of ward work. What he'd actually done was seal 3 specific magical traits in the infant Harry that he'd assessed, through some means the ritual records couldn't fully illuminate, as too dangerous or too ungovernable to leave intact in a child he intended to place with Muggles. The remaining 41 had been created in the aftermath of that night in Godric's Hollow, in the hours between Voldemort's fall and Dumbledore's arrival to take Harry to the Dursleys, a window of time that had always been slightly vague in the official accounts. 41 fractures in one night. The ritual specialists' report noted it was the most sustained and precise piece of dark magical surgery they had ever documented, and they'd consulted records going back 8 centuries. Dumbledore had been extraordinary at it, which made it worse somehow. That level of precision required love of craft as well as intent. Why? Harry said. Not angry. Genuinely asking. Ragnok considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The records can't give us his internal reasoning. But the pattern of what was sealed is informative. He opened the analysis to a flag more actions request aborted right the next chapter now. Chapter 2, the 44. The analysis was 40 pages long and read like a medical report written by someone who found the subject both fascinating and appalling in equal measure. Ragnok had flagged 7 sections in particular, and he walked Harry through them with the methodical precision of a surgeon explaining an X-ray to a patient who was going to need surgery regardless of how they felt about it. Harry sat across the desk, the document flat between them, and read while Ragnok talked, and the picture that assembled itself was not the one Harry had spent 15 years constructing about who he was and why. The first flagged section covered the 3 fractures created before Godric's Hollow. 2 of them were magical instincts, the kind of deep-rooted awareness that, according to the specialist's notes, manifested in certain lines of old wizarding families as something closer to a 6th sense than a skill. An awareness of magical intent. The ability to feel the shape of a spell before it was cast, the way a musician hears a chord resolving before the final note is played. The third was stranger, a linguistic capability, sealed so early and so thoroughly that even the ritual had struggled to fully catalogue it, buried under layers of Dumbledore's work like something he'd particularly wanted to ensure Harry never accessed. What is it? Harry asked, looking at the notation. Parseltongue is part of it, Ragnok said. But only the surface part. What was sealed was something older, an affinity for the magical languages. Not just snake speech. The language the ritual was performed in today. He let that land. You understood some of it. Harry looked up. He had understood some of it. He'd told himself he was imagining it, that he was reading meaning into sounds that happened to pattern themselves like meaning. But he'd understood keep your hands still and the fractures are confirming in something that translated roughly as this is more than we expected spoken between 2 of the robed goblins when he was at fracture 23. He'd filed all of it under stress response and moved on. The older goblin language, Ragnok continued, is one of 6 or 7 magical languages that share a common root, a proto-language that predates the divergence of most magical species. Parseltongue is a degraded branch. What you had, before it was sealed, was closer to the source. He paused. Dumbledore would have recognized it immediately. It would have made you considerably harder to manage. Harry felt something slot into place with a precision that was almost audible. The remaining 41 fractures from that night in Godric's Hollow fell into 5 broad categories, according to the specialist's analysis: magical capability, memory, personality, instinct, and something the report called relational architecture, which Ragnok explained meant the capacity for certain kinds of connection, certain depths of trust and attachment, that had been scaled back to make Harry more pliable, more dependent on whatever guidance structures Dumbledore intended to put around him. He didn't remove your ability to love people, Ragnok said, and his tone was precise and careful in the way of someone walking near something breakable. He removed your ability to trust your own judgment about them. Your instinct to assess people on your own terms, independent of what you were told about them. Harry thought about Snape. About how long he'd spent trying to reconcile what his gut told him with what Dumbledore implied. About Ron, about the Weasleys, how completely he'd accepted them, how entirely his trust had been given over to the first people who'd been kind to him, because his ability to calibrate had been removed before he was old enough to use it. He thought about Dumbledore himself, the faith Harry had maintained, against evidence, against instinct, because the instinct had been taken. Right, Harry said quietly. He turned to the next flagged section. The magical capability fractures were perhaps the most straightforwardly staggering. 5 of them related to raw power. The ritual specialist noted that Harry's fully integrated magical output would likely register in the top fraction of a percent of all documented wizards in British history. But what was more interesting than the scale was the nature. The sealed portions included a sophisticated relationship with wandless magic that should, by rights, have been developing naturally since he was about 3 years old, and an instinctive grasp of magical theory that would have made his Hogwarts education feel like reviewing things he already knew. I've been struggling through transfiguration essays for 6 years, Harry said, his voice very flat. You have been struggling through transfiguration essays with approximately 43% of your brain, Ragnok agreed. Harry leaned back in his chair. He felt the absurd urge to laugh, which he understood was mostly shock wearing a more manageable face. He let it pass. The memory fractures, Ragnok said, moving to the next section. These are the most extensive. 22 of the 44 are primarily memory-based. Half of them. They cover the first 14 months of your life, which is outside the range of normal human memory retention, so their absence wouldn't be noticed by conventional means, but also, and this is the part our specialists found most troubling, several months' worth of embedded knowledge that would have been transferred to you in the womb and in early infancy through magical means by your mother. Harry went very still. My mother. Lily Potter was an extraordinarily gifted witch, Ragnok said. Not in the way she tends to be described, as a remarkable talent who happened to reach her potential young. She was engaged, in the last year of her life, in magical research that we at Gringotts were privileged to have some awareness of, because she had consulted with us regarding certain ancient texts we hold. He opened a drawer and placed a small leather folder on the desk between them. She was working on a theory about the nature of magical inheritance, specifically, how magical knowledge could be preserved and transmitted to a child in ways that bypassed the need for formal education. Harry looked at the folder. He didn't touch it yet. The magical equivalent of downloading, he said. Ragnok's expression did something complicated. I was told you had not been raised in the magical world. Your grasp of analogy is impressive. He tapped the folder. She succeeded, to a significant degree. Several months before your birth, she performed a series of rituals, nothing like today's, far simpler, that embedded a framework of magical knowledge into your core. Not spells exactly. More like, the grammar of magic. The underlying structure, so that when you encountered spells formally, you would recognize them the way a native speaker recognizes grammatical patterns they were never explicitly taught. And Dumbledore sealed it. Every bit of it. 19 fractures out of the 22 memory-type fractures consist of what your mother gave you. Ragnok's voice, which had remained clinically precise throughout this entire conversation, shifted by the smallest degree into something that had an edge to it. The remaining 3 are memories of her. Direct memories, encoded magically. Your mother, clearly, was aware that your ordinary infant memory would not retain her face or her voice, and she addressed that deliberately. He looked at Harry. Those 3 fractures are the reason you cannot remember her. The room was very quiet. Harry put his hand flat on the desk, fingers spread, feeling the solidity of the wood. He'd wondered, his whole life, why he couldn't remember. Why other people seemed to have impressions of their very early childhood, vague, unreliable, but present, and he had nothing. A flash of green light. A high, cold laugh. The things that should have been burned away by terror were the only things he'd kept, and the things that should have been protected, her face, her voice, the feeling of being held by her, were gone. They'd been taken. Deliberately. On purpose. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and did not allow himself any of the things he wanted to do in that moment, because they were in a goblin bank and none of those things were appropriate, and more importantly, he had a feeling they would be counterproductive. The rage from Fracture 37 was there, cold and precise and patient. It could wait. "They're back now?" he asked. "The ritual has reintegrated them, yes." Harry nodded once. He didn't say anything else for a moment, and Ragnok, who seemed to understand the value of silence, did not fill it. When Harry looked up, his expression was settled and his eyes were clear. "Keep going." By the time Ragnok reached the final flagged section, the afternoon had gone fully golden through the narrow windows set high in the chamber walls, and Harry had consumed 3 cups of something hot that tasted like coal and ginger and had the effect of keeping his mind very sharp when it would otherwise have liked to go somewhere quieter and process things. He suspected the goblins served it deliberately in situations like this. The final section was the one Ragnok had saved. "The treaty clause," Harry said. "The treaty clause." Ragnok spread the relevant document on the desk. It was old, not the 300-year-old old of most of Gringotts' serious paperwork, but genuinely ancient, the kind of old that made the air around it feel slightly thicker. The text was in 3 languages simultaneously, an old form of English that Harry had to squint at, the goblin script that he now found his eyes moved along with surprising ease, and a third language he didn't recognize but that his newly reintegrated instincts told him was a very old form of Latin with something else folded into it. "The Treaty of 872, Ragnok said, was brokered under Merlin, not as a historical convenience, but factually. Merlin, who at the time was acting as mediator between the Goblin nation and the newly consolidated wizard communities of Britain. The treaty's primary function was practical. It formalized the division of magical labor and magical territory between goblins and wizards. Goblins maintained the deep magic, the ward structures, the boundary workings, the infrastructure magic that requires long continuity and connection to the land. Wizards maintained the surface magic, governance, education, the kind of social magic that needs to adapt quickly. The goblins got the foundation and the wizards got the house, Harry said. Precisely. And like any house, it has depended entirely on the foundation remaining intact. Ragnok traced a line of text with one long finger. The voiding clause exists because the goblins, when drafting the treaty, were not naive. They understood that wizard governing bodies had a tendency to expand their definition of what they were entitled to. The clause states, in brief, that if it is demonstrated that a wizard or wizard body has used goblin magical infrastructure, specifically including goblin ritual instruments, to cause deliberate magical harm to a wizard of significant lineage, and if this harm was concealed from the goblin nation, then the treaty is considered void. Because the goblins maintained the wards that protected the person being harmed, Harry said slowly. Which means the goblins were made complicit in it without knowing. Ragnok looked at him with the amber eyes. Yes. And the lineage qualification. What counts as significant? We have been investigating that since we first identified the fractures. Ragnok placed a second document beside the first, this one newer, densely annotated. Harry, what do you know about the Potter family history? Harry thought about it. Not much. Old family. My dad had money. Gryffindors for generations, according to everyone who's ever mentioned it. The Potters are one of 12 families whose magical lineage predates the treaty by at least 3 generations, Ragnok said. Which means your ancestors were present, and significant, when the treaty was negotiated. Which means the clause applies. Which means when Dumbledore used goblin ritual infrastructure to perform 44 fractures on a Potter heir, Harry said, the goblins were made unknowing party to it, and the treaty is void. The treaty, Ragnok said, is void. He said it with the finality of a door closing. And the wards fail at midnight, Harry said. At midnight. Yes. Harry sat forward. How bad is it? That depends entirely on who and what has been relying on the wards being up. Ragnok folded his hands. The Ministry's primary defensive perimeter around Wizarding Britain, the one that keeps Muggle detection equipment from identifying magical activity, runs on treaty authority. It fails. The blood wards on individual properties, most of them fail, because they're keyed to treaty provisions for their legal continuity. Hogwarts is more complicated. The school has its own ancient magical claims that predate the treaty, so it won't go entirely dark, but significant portions of its ward structure will. St. Mungo's will lose its concealment. Diagon Alley will lose its concealment. He paused. And the boundaries. The old territorial markings that have kept certain things, certain creatures, certain presences, certain old magics that predate the treaty and that the treaty effectively contained, on the correct side of their agreements. Things that were being held back, Harry said. Things that were being held back. Harry stood up. He walked to the narrow window and looked out at the slice of Diagon Alley visible from this angle, the ordinary magical afternoon of it, people with shopping bags and owls and children pulling their parents toward Weasley's wizard wheezes. He watched it for a moment. Dumbledore doesn't know this is happening yet, he said. Almost certainly not. He would not have expected the ritual to be triggered. The instrument was Sirius Black's, filed under seal, and would not have appeared in any standard account review. We located it through a separate investigation. Ragnok paused. He will know soon. When the ward systems begin registering anomalies tonight, the Ministry will be contacted, and eventually they will trace it to us. And when they do, they will come here, Ragnok said. With lawyers and demands and very loud voices. This is historically how wizards respond to goblin legal actions they don't like. What do you need from me? Ragnok picked up a third document. We need you to formally accept the finding of the ritual and assert your rights as the injured party under the Void Clause. We need you to formally void the treaty yourself, on the record, rather than having it void automatically. The difference matters legally because it makes you, not the clause, the acting party. And we need you to be present when Dumbledore comes, because, he met Harry's eyes, because whatever conversation happens at that point will go very differently if you are in the room and he does not know what you have recovered. Harry held his gaze. You want me there to see his face when he realizes the game's changed. I want you there because you are the wronged party and you have legal standing and your presence is required, Ragnok said, with the perfect composure of a goblin saying one thing while meaning a second thing that both parties are entirely clear on. The other thing I mentioned is simply an additional consideration. Despite everything, despite the rage that was sitting cold and patient in his chest, despite the weight of 44 fractures now integrated and pressing against the inside of his skull like new furniture in a room that hadn't known it was too sparse, Harry felt the corner of his mouth move. Right, he said. Then let's get the paperwork done. He signed 3 documents, initialed 6 clauses, and pressed his palm to a surface that recorded his magical signature with a warmth that felt like a handshake conducted at the molecular level. The treaty voiding was registered at 4:47 in the afternoon. Ragnok had a copy sent to the Ministry's legal archives by Goblin courier, the fastest method, and the one least likely to be intercepted, and kept 2 copies in the Gringotts vault that Harry was privately certain was the single most secure location in Britain. Then Ragnok did something Harry hadn't expected. He slid a small iron key across the desk. Your vault, Ragnok said. You have accessed it before, of course. But there is a secondary vault, registered under your family's full lineage rather than the Potter account alone, that has been sealed since 1981. It is now accessible to you. Harry picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked, which seemed appropriate. What's in it? We have not opened it. It is not our vault. A pause. We believe Sirius Black left something there for you. Among other things. Harry closed his hand around the key. Not today, he said. I need to, he stopped, recalibrated, because what he'd been about to say was I need to think, which was the reflexive response, the old pattern. He didn't need to think. He knew what needed doing. I need to talk to my friends, he said instead. Tonight, before midnight. Before the wards go. That is a reasonable priority, Ragnok said. And I need someone to tell me everything Gringotts knows about what those old territorial boundaries were containing. The things that were being held back. Ragnok's expression shifted into something that was the goblin version of satisfaction. He reached under the desk and produced a document that was clearly already prepared. I had anticipated that question, he said. Harry took the document. He didn't open it yet. One more thing. The wards on my aunt's house, the blood wards. They're failing at midnight. Yes. I don't care about protecting the house, Harry said. But my aunt and cousin are in it, and they're not magical. If there are things coming through the old boundaries that have opinions about muggles, we will arrange alternative protections for the residents of the property, Ragnok said, and there was something in his voice that was entirely genuine. Through our own ward system, which does not depend on the treaty. They will be safe. Harry nodded. He stood up, tucked the documents under his arm, and put the key in his pocket. Then he looked at Ragnok across the desk. Thank you, he said. And I don't mean for the tea. Ragnok looked back at him. You have been robbed, Mr. Potter. Profoundly and systematically. We are not doing you a favor. We are correcting an injustice. He rose as well. But you are welcome. Harry found a quiet corner of the leaky cauldron, which required waiting for a table to open up in the back section where Tom the barman rarely bothered to go, and then he sent 2 letters by the pub's house owl, a mangy creature that gave him a deeply skeptical look but accepted the task when he slipped it an extra sickle. The first letter was to Ron. It said, Something's happened. I need you and Hermione at the leaky cauldron tonight. Don't tell your mum where you're going. 7 o'clock. Harry. The second was to Hermione, and was somewhat longer, because Hermione would want context in advance or she'd spend the time between receiving the letter and arriving at the pub running through every possible scenario independently, which was an exhausting way to spend an afternoon. He told her, something significant had happened at Gringotts, it involved his family history, there were legal implications that affected the whole of magical Britain, and nobody was in immediate danger. He added a 4th sentence because he knew her. Yes, it's as serious as it sounds, no, I'm not being dramatic, please just come. Then he ordered food, spread Ragnok's prepared document on the table, and read. The document was a Gringotts intelligence summary, a category of document Harry hadn't known existed, which made sense given that the Goblin Nation having an intelligence operation was not something the Ministry would have encouraged people to know. It was precise, dense, and written with the particular style of someone who expected their reader to be intelligent enough to manage their own emotional response to the information provided. The territorial boundaries maintained by the treaty were older than the treaty itself. They'd been formalized in 872, but they described and reinforced divisions that had existed in the magical landscape for much longer, in some cases going back to before Roman Britain, to the deep native magic of the island that predated any organized wizard community. The treaty had essentially ratified the status quo, kept the old things in their places, maintained the agreements that the island's magic had worked out with itself over millennia of negotiation between its various inhabitants. What those old things were was described in an appendix that read, in parts, like mythology and in other parts like a field manual. There were the boundary fae, not the diminished creatures that most wizards associated with fairy tales, but older things, pre-divergence entities that had agreed, when the treaty was signed, to remain in certain territories in exchange for the ward structures maintaining those territories as inviolable. With the wards down, those territories were no longer inviolable, and the boundary phase agreements were null. There were the deep dwellers, a category that encompassed several types of creature that had been, for lack of a better word, contained beneath certain geographical features of Britain since well before the treaty. The document noted, with clinical understatement, that several of these creatures had unresolved disputes with the wizard community from before the containment. There were the territorial claims of the Centaur Herd Network, which ran on treaty provisions for their legal recognition, and which, without those provisions, would technically revert to pre-treaty law, under which the centaurs had significantly broader rights of action than anyone in the modern wizard world was comfortable thinking about. There were the sea ward systems on the British coast, maintained by the mere people under treaty provisions, which kept certain things in the deep Atlantic from getting curious about what was on the other side of Britain's maritime boundary. Harry read to the bottom of the document. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the leaky cauldron, which was low and yellowed with decades of smoke and entirely indifferent to the scope of what he was contemplating. "All right," he said to himself. He folded the document, picked up his fork, and finished his food with the focused attention of someone who understood that what was coming would be significantly easier to manage if he was not doing it on an empty stomach. Ron arrived first, at 6:52, still in jeans and a jumper that was slightly too warm for July, his hair doing the thing it did when he'd been moving fast and the wind had opinions. He dropped into the chair across from Harry, looked at his face for approximately 3 seconds, and said, "How bad?" "Sit down," Harry said. "I'll wait for Hermione." "I'm already sitting down." Ron leaned forward. "Seriously. How bad is it?" "You look," he stopped. "Actually, you look different." "What happened to you looking different?" "That's part of it." "Harry." "Ron, I need to tell this once and I need Hermione here for it because if I tell you first you'll have a reaction and then when I tell Hermione she'll have a different reaction and I'll be managing 2 separate reactions and I can't do that tonight, I have too much else to manage." Ron considered this and apparently found it reasonable. "Fine. But you're getting me another drink." Hermione arrived at 7 on the dot, slightly breathless, a bag over her shoulder with several books visible at the top because of course she'd prepared. She sat down, looked at Harry with the same sharp assessment Ron had, and said, "You look different." "So I've been told." "Your eyes are different." "Yeah." He waited until she'd settled. "Okay. I'll tell you everything and then you can ask questions, but let me get through it first." He told them. Not everything, not the personal parts, not the memories of his mother, not Fracture 37 and the cold specific rage, but the facts of it, laid out in sequence. The letter. Ragnok. The ritual. The 44 fractures. Who had created them and when? The treaty clause. The wards failing at midnight. When he finished, the table was quiet for a long moment. Ron was the first to speak. His voice was very controlled, which for Ron meant the thing underneath it was not controlled at all. "Dumbledore did this to you?" "Yes." 44 times. "Yes." Ron put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Harry recognized the posture, Ron processing something at the level that was below words, the deep gut place where his loyalty lived and where, when something touched it the wrong way, the response was physical before it was verbal. "Right," Ron said, and his voice had gone to a place Harry had only heard it go a handful of times, in moments of genuine, bone-deep anger. "Right." Hermione hadn't spoken. Harry looked at her. She was sitting perfectly still in the way she only ever sat perfectly still when her brain was moving very fast, which he'd learned meant she was reconstructing something, taking a picture she'd held and overlaying new information until the picture changed. "He had reasons," she said finally. "That's not me defending him. That's me saying we should understand them." "We should absolutely understand them," Harry agreed. "When he gets here tomorrow." Hermione's head came up. "He's coming here. Ragnok expects him at Gringotts when the Ministry traces the ward failures." Harry looked between them. "I need to be there." "We need to be there," Ron said immediately, and Hermione nodded, and something in Harry's chest, one of the newly reopened rooms, one of the recovered pieces, warmed in a way that was entirely new and entirely recognizable at the same time. He'd known these two loved him. Of course he'd known that. But the knowing now was different, unfiltered, uncalibrated by anything other than his own clean assessment of them. Ron, who was furious on his behalf with a simplicity and totality that was one of the most uncomplicated gifts Harry had ever received. Hermione, who was already building toward understanding because that was how she loved people, by trying to comprehend everything around them so she could defend them more effectively. "There's more," Harry said. He placed Ragnok's territorial document on the table. "The wards failing isn't just a concealment problem." He watched their faces as they read. Ron's went from controlled anger through confusion and landed somewhere near grim determination. Hermione's moved through several phases of intellectual engagement before arriving at something that looked like genuine alarm, which on Hermione was worth taking seriously. "The boundary fae," she said, pointing at a line in the document. "They're not," she stopped. "Most people think they're a category of smaller magical creature. But the pre-treaty texts describe them as something much more significant. They were parties to the original magical settlement of Britain. If their agreements are void, they can move freely," Harry said. "Yes. And the deep dwellers." She looked up. "Harry, I've read about these there's a text, Chronicon Magicii Britanniae, that describes 3 containment events. One in 400 AD, one in 647, and the one that preceded the treaty. Each time the containments failed, the historical record describes a period of," she looked for the word, "restructuring. Of the entire magical landscape. Months of it." "Is that a polite way of saying it was chaotic and violent?" Ron asked. "It's a very polite way of saying it was chaotic and violent, and the wizard community at the time essentially had to renegotiate reality from the ground up." Hermione looked at Harry. "What's the plan?" "Ragnok and I are going to draft new treaty terms. But that takes time, and the entities coming through the boundaries won't wait for paperwork." He looked at both of them. "What I need to know is who I can actually trust. Not who I've been told to trust. Not who it's convenient to trust." He paused. "My own assessment." Ron met his eyes. "You can trust us. You've always been able to trust us. That hasn't changed." "I know," Harry said. "That's why you're here." Outside, the London evening was doing its ordinary London thing, traffic and takeaway smells and someone's music from a passing car, and somewhere beneath the streets the clock was ticking toward midnight and the failing of a 1,000-year arrangement, and Harry sat with the people he trusted most in the world and felt, for the first time, ready. Not prepared. Not calm, exactly. But ready, which was different and better. At 11:58, sitting at that corner table, Harry felt the exact moment the first ward failed. It was like a sound stopping that he'd been hearing so long he'd stopped knowing he heard it. A frequency, gone. Then another. Then another. At midnight exactly, the silence where the wards had been was total. Ron looked up from the document. "It started, hasn't it?" "Yeah," Harry said. Outside, somewhere to the north of the city, something that had been pressed against the boundary for 1,100 years pressed its weight against it one more time. And found nothing there. Chapter 3, The Unraveling. The first sign that the world had changed was the sky. Harry noticed it at 12:04, standing at the narrow window of the room he'd rented upstairs at the Leaky Cauldron, the document from Ragnok still in his hand. The London sky, which was never really dark, always that particular orange-gray bruise of light pollution that city skies wore like a uniform, had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the way that would send people into the streets pointing upward. Just a quality change, a deepening in certain directions that had nothing to do with clouds or weather and everything to do with something very old and very patient exhaling for the first time in a millennium. He watched it for a moment. Then he went back to reading. Hermione had taken over one side of the small table in the corner of the room and covered it with books she'd produced from her bag with the focused efficiency of someone who had absolutely prepared for a crisis even when she hadn't known what crisis she was preparing for. She was cross-referencing the Gringotts document with something called the Marginal Territories, a pre-treaty survey of British magical geography, which looked like it had been published before the printing press was a thing, and making notes with a quill that moved so fast Harry occasionally lost track of it. Ron was sitting on the windowsill eating crisps, watching the street below. He'd conjured a bag from somewhere and was working through it with methodical calm, which was how Ron handled things he couldn't immediately punch. There's something on the Thames, Ron said. Harry moved to the window. Ron pointed, and Harry followed the line of his finger to the river, which was visible in the middle distance as a dark ribbon catching city light. At least, the river was visible. What was on it was harder to describe, a quality of movement that wasn't water movement, a shimmer that sat about 3 inches above the surface and didn't behave the way reflections behaved. Mere people, Harry said. Testing the boundary. How do you know that? The document. The sea wards extend up the Thames estuary. If the coastal wards are down, he tracked the shimmer with his eyes, they'll be checking what they can access now. Ron ate a crisp thoughtfully. Are mere people dangerous? Depends entirely on who you ask. Harry looked at the document. According to Ragnok's team, the merpeople's treaty obligations included maintaining the sea boundary in exchange for certain territorial guarantees. Without the treaty, the territorial guarantees are gone, but so are the obligations. They're not aggressive by nature, but they have old grievances about fishing rights and coastal access that haven't been addressed since 872. So they might be annoyed. They might be significantly annoyed, yes. Right. Another crisp. What about the thing to the north you mentioned? Harry looked at his notes. The Pennine boundary. That's where the oldest deep dweller containment is. The document says the containment was established after what it describes as a, he found the line, period of significant territorial dispute between the dwellers and the early wizard settlements of northern Britain. That's very diplomatic language for what sounds like a war, Hermione said without looking up. That's very diplomatic language for what sounds like several wars, Harry agreed. He put the document down. We need to move early tomorrow. Before Dumbledore arrives at Gringotts and before the Ministry finishes panicking long enough to start doing something stupid. Define stupid, Ron said. Trying to re-establish the wards without Goblin cooperation. They'll attempt it, because that's what the Ministry does when goblins are involved in something they don't like, they try to solve it without goblins and make it worse. Harry looked at both of them. I need to be at Gringotts by 8. I need to see the secondary vault before Dumbledore arrives. And I need both of you with me, because what happens when he walks through those doors is going to require witnesses. Hermione closed her book. She'd been quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was working through something that required restructuring beliefs she'd held for a long time. Harry knew the look. He waited. I need to say something, she said. And I need you to let me say it without interrupting. Go on. I've spent 6 years defending Dumbledore. Every time something felt wrong, the Philosopher's Stone, the chamber, the whole situation with Sirius, everything last year, she stopped. I told myself there was a plan. That he knew things we didn't. That his judgment was the thing you deferred to when yours felt uncertain, because his was better. She looked at Harry directly. I was using his authority to paper over the gaps in my own certainty. And what I need to acknowledge is that the gaps were there because I was seeing them. I knew something was wrong and I chose the explanation that let me keep believing in the system. She paused. I'm not doing that anymore. The room was quiet for a moment. Good, Harry said. Not unkindly. Just cleanly. I'm still going to try to understand why he did it, she said. That's not me defending it. Understanding something is not the same as forgiving it. I know, Harry said. I want to understand too. Ron dropped the empty crisp bag in the bin from across the room, 7 feet without looking, sank it perfectly, and said, I've never defended him. I want that on record. It's on record, Harry said. Just want to be clear. Ron swung his legs off the windowsill and stood up. So. 8 o'clock at Gringotts. We should sleep. You should sleep, Harry said. I'm going to be up for a while. Ron looked at him for a moment. The stuff you got back today. The pieces. Are you? He paused in the careful way Ron paused when he was navigating emotional territory with more precision than people gave him credit for. are you okay with having them back? It's not. Another pause. Is it like having strangers in your head? Harry thought about it genuinely, because it deserved a genuine answer. No, he said. It's more like, you know how sometimes you dream about a place that doesn't exist but feels completely familiar. And you wake up and for a second you're almost certain it was real, and then ordinary life reasserts itself and you lose it? He looked at his hands. It's like waking up and finding out the place was real and you can go there whenever you want. It's mine. All of it was always mine. He looked up. Having it back doesn't feel strange. What's strange is realizing how strange it felt not to have it. Ron nodded slowly. Right. He crossed the room, clapped a hand on Harry's shoulder, firm, brief, entirely Ron, and said, "Get some sleep eventually," and went to the other room they'd taken down the hall. Hermione lingered. She was looking at Harry with the expression she wore when she was assembling a question from several smaller questions and trying to decide which one to lead with. "The memories of your mother," she said quietly. "They came back in the ritual?" "Yes." She didn't say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad," and there was so much underneath those two words that Harry felt them like a hand steadying him and didn't trust himself to say very much back. "Get some sleep," he told her. She left. Harry turned off the lamp and sat in the London half-dark and looked at the sky and let the 44 pieces of himself settle into their new configuration for a while, until somewhere around 2 in the morning he fell asleep in the chair without meaning to and dreamed, for the first time, in a language older than English. Gringotts in the early morning had a different character than it did during the day, fewer wizards, more goblins, the hum of the building's own operations more audible without the crowd to dampen it. Harry, Ron, and Hermione arrived at 8:10 and were shown through immediately, not to Ragnok's office but to a smaller antechamber where a young goblin, young being a relative term, he looked 12 and was probably 140, offered them the Kolan ginger drink and said the director would be with them shortly. Ragnok arrived 6 minutes later. He looked, for a goblin who Harry suspected never looked harried, something approaching harried. He closed the door, looked at Ron and Hermione with the assessment of someone making rapid calculations about how much he needed to explain versus how much they already knew, and apparently decided they were sufficiently briefed. "The ministry contacted us at 1:15 in the morning," he said, sitting down. "As predicted. The communication was from the Auror office initially, then from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and then, at 2:42, directly from the headmaster of Hogwarts." "What did Dumbledore say?" Harry asked. "He requested an emergency consultation. He was told the earliest available appointment was 9 o'clock. Ragnok's expression was entirely neutral. "He is currently in the waiting hall of the public reception area." Harry looked at the clock on the wall. 8:22. "The vault first," he said. The secondary vault was on a different track system than Harry's familiar vault. They went deeper, much deeper, descending through passages that Harry recognized from yesterday's ritual chamber route but then diverging, going further, past the level where temperature stopped being comfortable and into a zone where the stone itself seemed to breathe. Ron gripped the cart's edge with the focused intensity of someone managing a reasonable fear with unreasonable composure. Hermione had produced a small notebook from somewhere and was writing observations with the resigned air of a researcher who has accepted that fieldwork is sometimes physically uncomfortable. The vault was numbered with a symbol Harry couldn't read in any of the notational systems he knew, which Ragnok said was the original family glyph rather than the standard numbering. The key fit. The door opened. It was not a large vault. Unlike Harry's gold-stacked main vault, this one was more like a library crossed with an archive, shelves of carefully preserved documents, several objects on stands under preservation spells, and in the center a low table with a single sealed envelope and a small wooden box. Harry went straight to the envelope. He recognized the handwriting immediately. He'd seen it on official order of the Phoenix Communications, on a note he'd found in old papers of his parents, on a letter he'd been given by Dumbledore once, briefly, and which had always seemed slightly raw with personality. Serious. He broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages. Harry read it standing, and Ron stood beside him and read over his shoulder without being invited, which Harry had always privately found more comforting than annoying, and Hermione gave them both a moment before moving to examine the objects on the shelves. The letter began, Harry. If you're reading this, the ritual worked and Ragnok is better at his job than even he thinks he is, which given that he thinks he's exceptional is saying something. I'm writing this in October 1981 and I have no idea when you'll read it. You might be 15, you might be 25, you might be in circumstances I can't predict. What I know is that you'll be reading it after getting your pieces back, which means you'll know what Dumbledore did, which means you'll need to understand why I didn't stop him. Harry read that line twice. I couldn't stop him. I want to be absolutely clear about that, not that I didn't try, because I did, and not that I was weak, because I'm choosing to believe I wasn't. But Albus Dumbledore is the most powerful wizard of the age and he believed, with a totality that genuinely good people can believe terrible things, that what he was doing to you was necessary. When I found out, 2 days after the fact, when the evidence was unmistakable and your godfather's instincts were screaming and I went to see Lily's sister and felt what had been done to you in the magic of the house, I went to him. He explained it. He was very calm and very kind and he explained that you needed to be ordinary. That the prophecy meant your life was going to be anything but, and that if you went into it with the full weight of what you actually were, Harry, and I'm sorry I can't be there to explain that in person, you would either be destroyed by it or become something that couldn't be saved. He said he was protecting you. He said he was giving you a childhood. He was doing those things. He was also doing something else, which is that he was making sure you were manageable. And I think Albus genuinely doesn't know the difference between those two motivations. I think he believes they're the same. That's what makes him dangerous in a way that Voldemort never quite was. Voldemort knows he's terrible and chooses it. Albus thinks he's good and that's not a belief he can examine. I signed the instrument because someone had to. Your parents were gone. I was going to be taken to Azkaban within hours, yes, I knew, because Albus was the only one who knew the full truth and he wasn't going to tell it, and someone needed to ensure that someday, when the time was right, you could get back what was taken. Ragnok's team will have found the filing date and the circumstances. They're smart enough to have done that. The box on the table is from your mother. She made it 6 months before you were born, when she first understood what she was doing with the knowledge transfer work and understood also, because your mother was the smartest person I ever knew and I knew your father, that not everyone watching her would be comfortable with what you'd become if she succeeded. She made the box for it just in case. Inside it is a record of everything she transferred to you, a key, essentially, to help you understand what you're working with now that you have it back. There are also things in this vault from your family that Dumbledore doesn't know exist, because your grandparents on both sides were smart enough to keep Goblin accounts that Albus never had access to, and because your mum was even smarter than your grandparents. Use them. All of them. You've earned them by surviving this far. I love you. I'm sorry I'm not there. Be magnificent. Padfoot. Harry stood still for a long moment. Beside him Ron was very quiet, the specific quiet of someone who has read something they feel they probably shouldn't have but can't unsay the reading of. You okay? Ron said. Yeah. Harry's voice was steady. He folded the letter carefully along its original folds and put it in his inner pocket. Yeah, I am. He picked up the wooden box. It was warm in his hands, not the warmth of the room, the warmth of something that had been made with intent. His mother's intent, specific and personal and 15 years preserved. He opened it. Inside was a small disk of something that looked like silver but moved like mercury, kept in place by the box's preservation spell, and around it was wound a length of what looked like very fine thread but that his instincts identified immediately as condensed magical notation, the physical encoding of an enormous amount of information in a medium that could only be read by the person it was keyed to. When he picked up the disk it gave him a flash, not painful, not invasive, more like a very brief and very thorough conversation, and then settled into a warmth that spread up his arm and sat in his chest and was, unmistakably and without question, his mother. Not her voice. Not her face. The feeling of her, which was what she'd intended, and which the fracture sealing had kept from him for 15 years, and which was now sitting in his chest like something he could breathe properly around. He put the disc in his pocket with the letter. He looked at the shelves. "We'll come back for the rest," he said. "We have 12 minutes before Dumbledore's appointment." Hermione had found something on the shelf she was staring at with an expression between excitement and awe. "Harry. This shelf here," she gestured, "these are your grandmother's research journals. Doria Potter Black. She was working on ward theory in the 1950s and 60s, and the consensus has always been that her work was lost and," she stopped herself. "Later." "Yes. 12 minutes. Let's go." Ragnok had arranged the meeting room deliberately. Harry understood this the moment they walked in, the chairs on one side of the table for Gringotts representatives, the chairs on the other side in a configuration that gave the arriving party a clear sense of how many people they were facing, and at the head of the table a single chair that was unmistakably positioned as the seat of authority, which Ragnok took without ceremony and with absolute comfort. Harry sat to Ragnok's right. Ron and Hermione sat beside Harry. Two senior Gringotts legal goblins Harry hadn't met before sat to Ragnok's left, their documents arranged before them with the pointed neatness of people who are ready to deploy paperwork as a weapon. Dumbledore came in at 9:03. He was not alone, Minerva McGonagall was with him, which Harry hadn't expected, and a ministry official Harry didn't recognize, a woman with the tightly controlled expression of someone whose morning had consisted entirely of bad news. Behind them, slightly separate, was Cornelius Fudge, looking like a man who had been woken at 2 in the morning by events that he had no framework for and had been in full panic suppression mode ever since. Dumbledore took in the room in one sweep. His eyes moved across Ragnok, the legal goblins, and then reached Harry. He stopped. Not physically, he kept walking to the table, sat down in the chair across from Ragnok, arranged his robes, set his hands on the table in the unhurried way of someone who was buying half a second while they recalibrated. But his eyes, which had found Harry and registered what they found there, did something Harry had never seen them do before. They went uncertain. Not for long. A fraction of a second, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for it, and Harry was absolutely watching for it. Then the uncertainty was gone and the familiar warm authority was back, and Dumbledore said, with the voice that had always made Harry feel simultaneously reassured and 10 years old, "Harry, my boy. I didn't expect to see you here." "I know," Harry said. The two words sat in the room very simply. No hostility in them, no performance. Just information. McGonagall was looking at Harry with the expression she wore when she was putting something together rapidly and didn't like what it was assembling into. Fudge was looking at the table. The ministry official was looking at her documents. Dumbledore, whose eyes hadn't fully left Harry, appeared to make a decision to engage Ragnok first. "Director Ragnok. I understand you have significant concerns about, Mr. Dumbledore," Ragnok said, and his voice was the kind of pleasant that had iron underneath it. "Before we discuss concerns, I want to establish clearly for the record what has occurred. As of yesterday, Gringotts completed an inheritance ritual on Mr. Harry James Potter, commissioned by a pre-existing legal instrument. The ritual found 44 magical fractures in Mr. Potter's core." He paused precisely long enough. "We have identified the creator of those fractures. The magical signature is yours." Silence. Fudge's head came up. The ministry official went very still. McGonagall's face changed. Dumbledore said nothing for 4 full seconds. Then, "That is a significant claim, Director. I would be interested to understand what you believe you have found." "What I believe is documented extensively and already filed with the relevant legal bodies," Ragnok said. "I am not here to discuss belief. I am here to inform you of the legal consequences." He opened the primary document. "The void clause of the Treaty of 872 has been triggered. The treaty is void. The formal declaration was signed yesterday at 4:47 in the afternoon by the injured party." He looked up. Mr. Potter. Dumbledore looked at Harry again. And this time Harry looked back without any of the things that used to be there, the deference, the hope for approval, the reflexive trust that was not trust at all but the absence of the tools to form independent judgment. He looked at Dumbledore the way he now looked at everything, clearly, with his own eyes. "You knew," Harry said. "Not an accusation. A statement. When you created the fractures, you knew about the void clause. You knew that if the ritual was ever completed, the treaty would fail. Harry, I'm not asking you to explain. I'm telling you what I know." Harry kept his voice entirely level. "You created 44 fractures in a 14-month-old child. You sealed my mother's memories of me away from me. You sealed her knowledge transfer, which she spent the last year of her life working on. You sealed 22 memories of my first year of life, which is the only year I had with my parents." He paused. "You then placed me with the Dursleys. Protected me with the blood wards, which you knew would fail the moment this ritual was completed, because you knew Sirius had filed the instrument." He tilted his head slightly. "You were always planning to let me get this back eventually. Weren't you? At some point. When you decided it was time." Dumbledore was very still. "But the timeline got complicated," Harry continued. "Voldemort came back faster than you expected. The war started moving before you were ready to reintegrate me. And now the instrument triggered on its own clock, not yours, and here we are." He looked at the older man steadily. "What I want to know, and I want you to understand, I'll know if you're not being straight with me, because that's one of the things that came back, is whether you intended to give it all back before I had to face him." The room was so quiet that the faint sounds of Diagon Alley above them were audible. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. And then something happened that Harry had never seen. In 6 years of knowing this man, Dumbledore's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Not with tears or raised voices. But the weight behind his eyes shifted, and what it shifted into was not guilt exactly and not sorrow exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has believed for a very long time that they were doing right and has suddenly found themselves in a room where that belief is sitting on a table being examined and has discovered that it doesn't quite hold together under the light. "Yes," Dumbledore said quietly. "I intended to restore you. When I believed you were ready. When I believed," he stopped. "Started again. I had very specific notions about when and how and under what circumstances. When you decided," Harry said. "Not when I was ready. When you decided." Dumbledore said nothing. "I need to say something to you," Harry said, "and then Ragnok is going to take over because there are legal matters that need addressing and you need to give the goblins your full attention." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't hate you. I want to be clear about that, because I suspect you're waiting to see whether I'm going to explode, and I'm not. What you did was wrong, profoundly, comprehensively wrong, and I think some part of you knows that, which is why you're sitting exactly the way you're sitting right now." He paused. "But I also think you're not a bad person, which is almost worse. Because bad people can be fought simply. People who do terrible things while believing they're good are much harder to address, because they keep finding reasons." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "I'm going to need you to sit in the discomfort of what you did. Not explain it. Not justify it. Just sit in it. And then we're going to figure out how to fix the mess the treaty collapse has made." He sat back and looked at Ragnok. "Your meeting." Ragnok, who had watched this exchange with the focused interest of someone watching a very fine piece of workmanship being executed, turned to Dumbledore and opened the primary document. "Mr. Dumbledore. The treaty is void. That is not a negotiating position, it is a legal fact already filed with both Goblin and British magical law bodies. What we are here to discuss is the framework for a new treaty, the terms of which will be significantly different from those of 872, because the circumstances that produced 872 no longer exist." He laid out 3 additional documents. "We have drafted preliminary terms. I will give you time to review them. However, I want to advise you in advance that under the new framework, Mr. Potter has been designated the British magical community's primary treaty signatory, because he is the injured party of record, because his family lineage predates the original treaty, and because, a pause of absolute precision, frankly, he is the only wizard in this room we trust. Fudge made a strangled sound. The ministry official looked up sharply. McGonagall, who had been sitting with the rigid posture of someone holding themselves together through effort, let out a breath that seemed to take something with it. Albus, McGonagall said. Her voice was clipped. Tight. I'm going to need a very detailed explanation. Not now. Later. She looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, for what it's worth, she stopped. I should have looked harder, she said finally. I knew your parents. I knew you as an infant. I've watched you for 6 years. I should have looked harder at the gaps. She held his gaze steadily in the way she held everyone's gaze, not asking for forgiveness, just making an accounting. I know, Harry said. And he did know, in the new cleaner way he knew things. McGonagall's guilt was real and her self-assessment was accurate, and she was the kind of person who wouldn't let the assessment stop at guilt but would move it into action. That was worth something. Outside the meeting room, something moved through the walls of Gringotts, not physically, but magically, a ripple that the Goblin legal team all felt simultaneously and that caused the 2 senior lawyers to look at each other with an expression of professional alertness. Ragnok felt it too. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at the room. The Boundary Fae, he said. They've begun moving. Harry looked at him. Where? Scotland. The Highland boundary. Simultaneously, our monitoring team is reporting significant activity on the Pennine Line and, a pause as a small stone on the table vibrated once, which appeared to be a communication method Harry hadn't encountered before. Something is in the Thames above Southwark Bridge that has not been there since 800 AD. What is it? Hermione asked, her notebook already open. Ragnok looked at the stone. The early records call them the Tide Watchers. Mere people of a significantly older classification than the ones we have current diplomatic relations with. He looked up. They were contained below the coastal boundary after a significant dispute with the wizard community of eastern Britain. They are not aggressive by nature. He paused again. They are, however, considerably more capable than their modern relatives. Ancient magical creatures emerging from containment, Hermione said, and her voice had the quality of someone keeping a list, Boundary Fae moving freely, ward structures failing across Britain. She looked at Harry, and we're sitting in a Gringotts meeting room. We're about to not be sitting in a Gringotts meeting room, Harry said. He looked at Ragnok. The Tide Watchers. Can we talk to them? Ragnok considered this with the deliberate care he brought to everything. In the old language, yes, theoretically. They predate English and most modern magical communication methods. He looked at Harry. You recovered the linguistic affinity in the ritual. I did. Then you may be the first wizard in over 1,000 years they would consider speaking to. Harry pushed his chair back. He looked at Ron, who was already standing, and Hermione, who was still writing and stood without looking up, which was impressive coordination. He looked at Fudge, who was staring at him with the expression of a man watching events proceed in ways he has no control over and is only beginning to accept this. The new treaty, Harry said to Ragnok. Hold the meeting. Keep going without me, because this is more urgent. He looked at Dumbledore, who was sitting with the documents in front of him and the expression of a man who was, possibly for the first time in a long time, in a situation he hadn't architected. You should read those terms carefully, Harry told him. They're fair. That might make them difficult for you. He turned and walked to the door. Harry, Dumbledore said. Harry stopped but didn't turn immediately. He gave it a beat, the measured pause of someone who no longer responds reflexively to his name being called by people with authority over him. Be careful, Dumbledore said. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of most of its usual orchestrated resonance. Just an old man's voice. Whatever is in the Thames, these are not creatures with human moral frameworks. They are old and they are powerful and they predate the concept of negotiation. I know, Harry said. So do I, as it turns out. He looked back once, briefly. I'll be fine. He went through the door. Ron and Hermione fell in behind him, and the door swung shut on the meeting room and the documents and the man sitting behind them who had spent 15 years making decisions about Harry Potter's life and was now sitting in a room negotiating the terms of a world he'd helped unmake. In the corridor, Hermione caught up beside Harry and said, voice low, the thing in the Thames. You actually think you can talk to it? Harry thought about the language in his chest, the one that had come back at Fracture 37's neighbor, the one that had surfaced in his dreams last night in ways he was still processing. He thought about the disc from his mother's box and the warmth it had left in him, the grammar of old magic settling into his understanding like a key turning in a lock. I think, he said, that it probably hasn't heard its own language from a wizard in 1,000 years. And I think that's a good place to start. Ron held the outer door open. The morning air came in, sharp and London ordinary and carrying on it, very faintly, something that smelled of deep water and old stone and things that had been waiting. Harry walked through the door into it. Chapter 4, Ancient Ground. The Thames at Southwark Bridge at 9 in the morning looked exactly like it always did, grey-green and purposeful, carrying the weight of the city on its surface the way the city carried the weight of its history, visibly and without complaint. Tourist boats were already moving. A man in a high-visibility jacket was doing something official-looking on the north embankment. Pigeons were conducting their regular territorial disputes on the bridge railing. The thing beneath the surface was less ordinary. Harry stood at the embankment wall and looked down at the water and felt it the way he now felt everything magical, not as an external perception but as information arriving through a channel that had always existed and was now unobstructed. The tide watchers were deep, pressed against the river bed where the silt was oldest, but their presence read in the water above them like heat reads in air, a distortion, a shimmer of something that wasn't the river's own character. How many? Ron asked, standing beside him with his hands in his pockets and his eyes doing the systematic sweep of the embankment that Harry had noticed him doing since they left Gringotts, cataloguing exits and angles with the instinct of someone who'd spent enough time in dangerous situations to have developed habits. Hard to tell. At least 4. Maybe more below those. Harry looked at the water. They're waiting. For what? To see what happens next, probably. They've been contained for 1,100 years. They're not going to rush. He looked sideways at Hermione. The Tide Watchers. What do you know about them beyond what the document said? Hermione had her notebook open. Of course she did. The pre-treaty records are fragmentary because most of them were written by wizards who were in conflict with these creatures at the time, which means the accounts are biased toward the confrontational and probably underrepresent the diplomatic history. But there are 3 references in Chronican Magicae Britanniae to interactions before the containment. She found the page. They described the Tide Watchers as distinct from standard Mere people in that they're significantly older. The text says they predate the formation of the current island, which would put them at, she looked up, geologically speaking, that's before Britain separated from continental Europe. Around 8,000 years ago. Minimum. 8,000 years, Ron said. Not impressed exactly. More the tone of someone recalibrating their scale of what impressive meant. The text also says they communicate in something it calls the First Water Language, which maps to what Ragnok told us about the proto-language family. The one you recovered. She looked at Harry. And it says the last wizard who successfully communicated with them was described as someone of, she squinted at the text, the deep blood and the old gift. Which is frustratingly vague but thematically consistent. Harry looked back at the water. Right, he said. Move back. How far back? Ron asked. Far enough that you're not in the water if this goes sideways. That's not as reassuring as you might think. Harry leaned on the embankment wall and looked at the water below and let himself reach down through the channel that was now open, not with magic exactly, more with attention, the specific focused quality of presence that the old languages seem to operate on. He didn't speak out loud. Not yet. He sent something downward, an acknowledgement. I know you're there. I know what you are. I know what was taken from you, and I know the taking is ended. The water moved. Not the surface stayed exactly as it was, gray-green and city purposeful. What moved was below that, a reorganization of depth, like something very large shifting its weight from one position to another. The pigeons on the bridge railing above took off simultaneously without apparent reason. The man in the high-visibility jacket on the north bank stopped what he was doing and stared at the river with the focused confusion of a muggle whose subconscious was receiving information his conscious mind had no framework for. Harry waited. The response came not as sound but as pressure, a weight of meaning pressing upward through the water, arriving in his chest before it arrived in his ears, and when it translated it was not words in any linear sense but a cluster of impressions that his new old linguistic instinct assembled into something like, who speaks the deep tongue, what wizard carries the river word, what has changed above the stone. He answered in the same register, not words, exactly, but shaped meaning pushed downward through the same channel. My name is Harry Potter. I'm the reason the wards came down. I carry the old gift through my mother's line. The treaty is void. I'm the one rewriting it. A long pause. Longer than he would have liked, standing at a public embankment in broad London daylight. Then, 4 figures rose through the water with the unhurried directness of things that had not needed to hurry for 8,000 years. They were not like the mere people Harry had seen at the bottom of the Hogwarts lake during the second task. Those had been eerily human in their general outline, cold-eyed and alien in specific ways but comprehensible. The Tide Watchers were larger, not massively so, but enough to register, and moved differently, with a density and intention that made the water around them behave as though it had opinions about their passage. Their faces were broad and flat with eyes the color of deep river water, that particular gray-green-brown that light barely reaches. Their upper forms were humanoid, below the waist they went somewhere that Harry's eyes accepted without being able to fully resolve into a specific shape, something that seemed to include the water itself as a component. They surfaced to chest height at the embankment wall and looked at Harry. Close up, through the channel, their presence was enormous, not aggressive, not threatening, but the enormity of something very old and very aware, the way a standing stone is enormous even though it doesn't move. The foremost one, Harry understood without being told that it was the eldest of the 4, that age worked differently here, and this one was something the others deferred to, pressed its communication through the water and the stone and the air between them. The ward breaker. The one of old blood. You are smaller than we expected. I get that a lot, Harry said out loud, and then pushed the same down through the channel because he wasn't sure the spoken word carried. Something in the eldest Tidewatcher's broad face shifted. Not quite a smile. The emotion underneath it was closer to surprised recognition, which given the creature's antiquity was probably the highest compliment available. What does the ward breaker want of the deep ones? To talk, Harry said. And to negotiate. Not for the ministry, they'll try to contact you themselves eventually, and I'd recommend making them wait. For me. For the new treaty. He paused. The old treaty was built on an injustice I didn't know about and didn't consent to. The new one won't be. I want your territorial guarantees restored, the ones the original treaty was supposed to protect and didn't, because the wizard community stopped honoring them within a century. I want the coastal and river rights recognized formally. In exchange, I want to know what the Tide Watchers need from the land side, and I want to work out what that looks like without anyone being contained again. The 4 of them were still. The eldest communicated something sidelong to the others in a register that Harry caught the edges of but couldn't fully parse, something about surprise and about old promises and about the smell of the blood that was speaking. Then, you carry the Deep Mother's working. The one who prepared the ground gift for you. Lily Potter, Harry said. My mother. She came to the river. 3 times before you were born. She asked us questions about the old languages. A pause that felt like watching something enormous turn in deep water. We answered her. It is why you can hear us. Harry was quiet for a moment. 3 times. His mother had come to the Thames 3 times while she was pregnant with him and spoken to the tide watchers about the old languages, and they had answered her, and that answer was part of what she'd built into the framework she'd given him before he was born. He pushed the emotion somewhere he could find it later and stayed in the present. Then we have a foundation, he said. For the conversation and for the treaty. He held the eldest one's deep water gaze. Will you come to the negotiation? When I call it? When? I don't know yet. Days. Maybe a week. He looked at the water, at the city reflected in it, at the ordinary London morning going about itself entirely unaware. Things are moving fast. Things have been moving slowly for 1100 years, the eldest tide watcher said, which contained somewhere inside it the impression of something that was not quite right but was in the same neighborhood. We can accommodate days. They sank. Not dramatically, no splash, no displacement, simply a return to depth, the water settling over them with the smoothness of something very practiced. Within 30 seconds the surface was entirely ordinary again. Ron walked up beside Harry. Well, he said. They're more reasonable than I expected. Ancient things usually are, Harry said. It's the things that've been around just long enough to develop grievances but not long enough to develop perspective that are the real problem. Like the Ministry, Hermione said, arriving on his other side. Like the Ministry, Harry agreed. He straightened up. We need to get north. The Pennine boundary is the one I'm most concerned about. The deep dwellers there are the ones the document described as having unresolved disputes with wizard settlements. And the boundary fae in Scotland are moving, which means someone needs to be there before the Ministry sends orders and makes things significantly worse. We can't be in 2 places, Ron said. No. Harry thought for a moment. Scotland first. The fae are in motion but they're not aggressive, they're territorial, and territory isn't a problem yet because no wizard community is actively in their space. The north is different. Whatever came through the Pennine boundary has been pressed against containment for over 1,000 years and has very specific memories of why. He looked at Ron. I need you to go to your dad. Quietly. Tell him what's happening, not the Ministry version, the real version. He needs to know, and he's the one person in the Ministry who'll actually listen and then do something sensible about it. Ron's eyebrows went up. Dad? Not, he stopped. Yeah, actually. Yeah, Dad. Right. He thought for a second. He's not going to handle the 44 fractures information calmly. I know. Tell him anyway. He deserves the truth and he'll be angrier if he finds out we kept it from him. Ron nodded, the particular nod of someone who has received instructions they agree with and is already planning the execution. What about Mum? Your mum will find out, Harry said, and her reaction will be what it will be. But your dad first. He looked at him steadily. Ron. When she finds out and she says things, about Dumbledore, about the situation, about me, remember she loves you all and that's where it comes from. Ron looked at him for a moment with an expression that was clear and uncomplicated. I know, he said. Same goes. He turned and walked, and Harry watched him go with the clean unobstructed awareness of someone who trusts what he sees and doesn't need to second-guess it. They apparat to the edge of Inverness because that was as close to the Highland boundary as Harry felt comfortable arriving blind. The morning was further along up here. Scotland ran on a slightly different relationship with the sun than London did, or at least it felt that way, the light coming at a different angle across different colors of green. They were on a hillside above the city, the Ness Valley spread below them, and to the north and west the Highlands proper beginning their argument with the sky. Harry felt the boundary fae before he saw any sign of them. They read differently from the tide watchers, less depth, more movement, a quicksilver quality in the magical landscape, like the difference between groundwater and a stream. They were everywhere and nowhere in the way that creatures who had spent 1100 years learning to exist within specific boundaries and then suddenly found those boundaries gone would be, exploring, assessing, moving through their recovered territory with the focus of people returning to a house they hadn't been inside since childhood and checking every room. Not aggressive. Not yet. The problem was that their territory and wizard territory overlapped significantly, because the treaty boundaries had been drawn in 872 to give wizards favorable access to land the Fae considered historically theirs, and the Fae knew this. How do we find the representative? Hermione asked. She was looking out over the valley with her notebook open, making notes on what she was sensing, which Harry had noticed was her primary mode of processing unfamiliar situations: document first, understand second, react third. We don't find them, Harry said. We let them find us. He looked out at the hillside. We're broadcasting magic just by being here, both of us. The Fae have been cut off from any wizard contact for over 1,000 years. We're, he thought about how to put it, interesting. Give it a few minutes. He sat down on a flat rock and looked at the valley. Hermione sat beside him and wrote. The wind was doing Highland things to both their hair, and the sky was the particular blue that existed in Scotland on good mornings and nowhere else. 11 minutes later, something sat down on the rock on Harry's other side. It looked approximately human in the way that a well-made replica of a thing looks approximately like the thing, close enough that your eye accepted it, different enough in several specific ways that your subconscious kept sending up small flags. The face was too symmetrical. The eyes were the wrong color in a way that changed depending on what direction you looked at them from, and the stillness was the stillness of something that had developed stillness as a deliberate skill rather than a natural state. It was dressed in something that was either very unusual modern clothing or the natural result of someone who'd been watching human fashion for decades and assembled their own conclusions about it. It looked at Harry with the evaluating attention of a chess player looking at a board in an interesting state. Ward breaker, it said. Its voice had a quality that sat slightly outside the range Harry normally associated with voices, as though the sound was arriving through more dimensions than the one it appeared to originate from. That's what I'm being called today, Harry said. I'm Harry. We know your name. The Fae representative's too symmetrical face made an expression that might have been amusement or might have been several other things simultaneously. We have been watching you since Gringotts. You move fast. Lot to do. Yes. It looked at the valley below. This was our territory. Before the treaty. Before the boundaries. Before wizards decided that what they could draw on a map they could own. It said it without particular heat, the tone of something that has made peace with a historical fact without making peace with the fact's justice. We were patient. 1100 years is not long. For you, Harry said. For us. It turned the changing eyes on him. You voided the treaty. You broke the thing that contained us. Why? I didn't do it to free you. I did it because the treaty was built on an injustice done to me personally. He held its gaze. But the effect is the same. And I'm not going to pretend I don't know that, or that it doesn't create an obligation. The Fae was quiet for a moment. Beside Harry, Hermione had stopped writing and gone very still with the stillness of someone who understands they are in the presence of something that requires her full human attention and is giving it that. Obligation, the Fae representative said. That is an interesting word for a wizard to use in conversation with us. It's the accurate word, Harry said. The new treaty, and there will be a new treaty, because the alternative is chaos that benefits nobody including you, will need to address the territorial question honestly. Which means I need to know what honestly looks like from your side. You want our terms. I want to understand what was taken from you so I know what needs giving back. There's a difference. Harry paused. The old treaty took your territory and called it a trade for wards that protected you. But you didn't need protecting from the things the wards protected against, you were those things, from the wizard perspective. So the trade was wizard settlements in your land in exchange for protection from yourselves. He let the absurdity of that sit for a moment. That's not a trade. That's extortion with paperwork. The two-symmetrical face went through several expressions simultaneously, which was disconcerting in a way that Harry filed under Do Not Stare. Then it said something to the hillside that wasn't addressed to Harry or Hermione but that caused three other presences Harry had been peripherally aware of to become more solid, more present, moving in from the surrounding landscape. The wizard speaks plainly, the representative said to the others. Not a translation, they could clearly hear Harry directly. More an editorial. One of the newly arrived presences, also approximately human, also with the two-symmetrical quality, said, in a voice that had the same multidimensional characteristic, the wizard broke the treaty that imprisoned us. That could be accident. It wasn't, Harry said. The wizard speaks of obligation in fair terms. That could be manipulation. It could be, Harry agreed. You'll have to decide that for yourselves. I can't prove intent. I can only tell you that the new treaty won't be drafted without your input and won't be signed without your agreement, and that those aren't concessions I'm offering, they're conditions I'm setting. The goblins agree. The ministry doesn't know yet but they're not the signatories. Who is the signatory? The representative asked. Me. Harry looked at it directly. And whoever you designate from your side. And the Tide Watchers, and the Centaurs, and the Deep Dwellers if we can reach an agreement with them, which is the next conversation I need to have. Another silence. The wind moved across the hillside with the impartiality of wind. You are trying to build a council, the representative said. I'm trying to build a treaty that reflects who actually exists in Britain and what they actually need, Harry said. What you call the structure is your business. The representative turned to the others. What passed between them wasn't verbal, Harry caught the edges of it, the old language instinct picking up something about age and claim and the deep mother's blood which seemed to be how the Tide Watchers had described him and which had apparently been communicated to the Fae through channels Harry didn't fully understand yet. We will send a representative to your negotiation, the lead Fae said finally. When you call it. It paused. But we want something from you now. Before the call. As a gesture of good faith that we can measure. What? The Highland settlements. 3 wizard communities that were established inside our ancestral boundary under the old treaty's provisions. Its gaze was steady. We are not asking you to remove them. We are asking you to acknowledge formally and publicly that they are in our territory by historical right. Just the acknowledgement. The communities can remain. We want the record to say the truth. Harry thought about it for perhaps 4 seconds. Done. I'll have Gringotts draft the acknowledgement and file it with the treaty record today. The Fae representative looked at him with the changing eyes and whatever it was that lived behind them. You are not what we expected wizards to be. I know, Harry said. Most wizards haven't had 44 reasons to understand what it feels like when someone else defines the terms of your existence. He stood up. We'll be in touch. He walked back down the hillside with Hermione beside him, and the 4 presences on the hillside above watched them go and did not follow, and the Highland air moved around them with the complete indifference to human affairs that was the Highlands' most consistent characteristic. That went better than it should have, Hermione said. They've been waiting 1,000 years to be heard, Harry said. Sometimes that's all it takes. The Pennine boundary was different. Harry knew at the moment they arrived at the edge of the moorland above the Ribble Valley, the landscape felt different, loaded with a specific charge that was not the quicksilver movement of Fae territory but something heavier, something that had been compressed by containment for so long that its release had the quality of a pressure differential. Like opening an airlock. The air itself tasted different here, and not in a clean Highland way. In the way of something that had been in the dark for a long time. They stood on the moorland edge and Harry looked out across the valley below where the old Roman road ran and where, if you knew how to look, the boundary line was still visible as a subtle wrongness in the landscape, a place where the colors didn't quite continue correctly from one side to the other. The boundary's still here physically, Harry said. Even with the wards down, the land remembers the line. What came through? Hermione asked, looking at her document. Two of the smaller categories, by Ragnok's report. The ones listed as Class 2 deep dwellers, they're not the catastrophic ones, those are still in the deep containment further north. Harry studied the valley. But Class 2 is not a comfortable designation. The document describes them as, he'd read it enough times to quote it, entities of territorial intelligence and sustained memory, with specific grievances regarding the wizard settlements of the Ribble and Wharf valleys established between 900 and 1050 AD. Sustained memory, Hermione said. That means they remember specifically. That means they remember specifically, Harry confirmed. The wizard settlements they're angry about are still there. Clitheroe. Skipton. Several smaller villages in the valleys. He looked at the document. Ragnok's monitoring team is showing 2 incidents overnight, minor property damage in Clitheroe, one Muggle family reporting something they described as a very loud sound from underground in the Wharf Valley that lasted approximately 4 minutes. That's not escalation yet, Hermione said. That's testing, Harry said. They're checking what they can do. What response comes? He put the document away. The wizard response is going to be Aurors within the next few hours, because the Ministry is already pulling incident reports from the overnight ward failure monitoring. When Aurors show up with combat magic and no capacity for communication, the testing phase ends and something else starts. So we need to get there first. We need to get there first. Harry looked at the valley. This one is different from the Tidewatchers and the Fae. Those were ancient enough that they developed patience. The Class 2 dwellers are ancient but their grievances are more specific, wizard settlements actively in their territory, wizard magic actively suppressing their existence. The emotional temperature is higher. Can you communicate with them the way you did with the Tidewatchers? Harry thought about it. The old language instinct reached downward into the ground below and found something, not the smooth deep communication of the river, but something rougher, more jagged, like a signal through interference. Present but obstructed. Differently. But yes. How do we keep them from treating us as the enemy before we get a word in? Harry looked at the ground. He crouched down and put his palm flat on the moorland grass, the way he'd put his hands in the basin the day before, open, deliberate, sending something downward that was not magic exactly but the specific attention that the old channels required. I know you're there. I know what was done to you. I ended it. I'm not the same as the ones who built the walls. The ground shifted. Just slightly. A vibration in the soil that his hand felt before his ears registered anything. Back up, Harry said quietly to Hermione. Not because they're going to attack. Just give me room. She moved back 10 feet. Harry stayed crouched with his hand on the ground and sent the next thing downward, his name, his lineage, the nature of the treaty void, and the specific acknowledgement, and this was the part that mattered most, he felt it instinctively, that he knew what containment felt like from the inside. 44 fractures, he pushed downward through the channel. Someone built walls in me too. I know what that costs. A pause that lasted long enough for Harry's knees to start informing him that crouching was a finite activity. Then the ground answered. It came up through his palm in the old language, not words, more like geological time made briefly communicable, layer upon layer of compressed experience being offered up for acknowledgement. The grievances were specific, names of wizard families, names of settlements, descriptions of magical workings used in the containment that had incorporated elements of the dwellers' own territory against them, their land's magic turned into the bars of their cage. The containment had not been clean or kind. It had been an act of wizard communities protecting themselves and choosing not to examine the ethics too carefully, which was a very familiar shape of wrong. Harry received it all. He didn't try to minimize it or argue with it. He just received it, which was apparently the correct response, because the ground voice quality shifted from compressed and urgent into something that was slightly less compressed. What does the ward breaker offer? Recognition, Harry said aloud and pushed downward simultaneously. Your territory acknowledged in the treaty record. The settlements in your territory to be formally notified that they exist in dweller land and to enter into a relationship of respect with that fact, which means no Muggle construction on certain sites you designate, no wizard workings on the boundary lines without consultation. He paused. And the deep containment further north, I want to discuss what was contained there and why, because the document I have is vague and I don't negotiate with partial information. A long pause. The deep containment is not Class 2, the ground said. The deep containment is a different agreement. Older. More complicated. Not all containment is unjust. Harry absorbed that. It was unexpected, he'd assumed all the containments were the same category of grievance, but the Class 2 dwellers were apparently making a distinction. Tell me. What came up through the ground next took approximately 4 minutes to receive and was the most complex thing Harry had processed through the old language so far, a history, compressed into sensation and geological time, of something that had been contained not by wizard force but by mutual agreement between the dwellers, the pre-treaty Fae, and the Mere people, because what was in the deep northern containment was something that none of them wanted loose either. The dwellers were not asking for its release. They were asking for acknowledgement that they had been party to the decision, not victims of it, and that the wizard assumption that all containment was wizard-imposed was arrogant and incorrect. Harry sat back on his heels. He breathed out slowly. The deep containment, he said to Hermione without turning around, is a separate issue. The pre-magical community entities down there are contained by agreement of all parties, not by wizard imposition. I need Ragnok's team to cross-reference their records. I heard, Hermione said, and he could hear her writing. I also heard you carrying on a conversation with the ground in a language I didn't know you could speak and I have many questions. Later. He looked back down at his hand on the soil. We have an agreement. Provisional, the ground said. Pending the treaty text. Pending the treaty text, Harry agreed. He lifted his hand. The vibration in the soil settled back into ordinary ground. He stood up and turned to Hermione, who was looking at him with the expression she wore when she'd witnessed something that her brain was going to need substantial time to fully incorporate and had decided to file the receipt and process later. You negotiated with entities inside the ground, she said. I did. In a pre-language linguistic form transmitted through physical contact with the soil. Also yes. Harry. She looked at him squarely. You know I mean this in the best possible way when I say that what Dumbledore sealed in you and the fact that he sealed it is the single most staggering act of waste I have ever contemplated. Harry looked at the moorland, at the valley below, at the sky over the Pennines doing its northern English thing of threatening rain without committing to it. He thought about being 11 on a train to Hogwarts with no knowledge of his family, no understanding of his own history, no ability to assess the people around him on his own terms. He thought about 6 years of struggling through magical theory that his mother had tried to build into his bones before he was born. He thought about Dumbledore's face in that meeting room, the half-second of uncertainty before the composure reasserted itself. Yeah, he said. It is. He picked up his jacket from where he'd set it on the moorland grass. Come on. We need to get back to London. Ragnok will have an update on the treaty negotiations and I want to talk to Sirius. Hermione blinked. Sirius is in Azkaban. Sirius, Harry said, pulling his jacket on, is in Azkaban on the testimony of a man who was present at the scene and who is now sitting in a Gringotts meeting room being confronted with the full legal consequences of what he's done over the past 15 years. He looked at her. And the wards on Azkaban ran on treaty authority. Hermione's eyes went wide. Not the wide of fear, the wide of someone following a logical chain to its conclusion and finding it both obvious and staggering. The Azkaban wards. Failed at midnight, Harry said. Like everything else. She stared at him. Then she said, very quickly, we need to go right now. I know, Harry said. That's why I said come on. They apparat to the Gringotts antechamber and found it considerably more populated than they'd left it. Ragnok was at the center of what appeared to be a controlled storm, 3 goblin legal staff moving documents around a large table, two of the monitoring specialists from earlier talking rapidly in Goblin script shorthand on a standing board, and in the corner, looking like someone who had been waiting with the focused patience of a person who has learned that waiting is itself a form of power, was Arthur Weasley. He stood up when Harry walked in. Arthur Weasley had the kind of face that was genuinely readable, not because he was simple, but because he didn't operate in the register where people learn to hide their immediate responses. His immediate response when he saw Harry was a complicated thing that moved through several stages rapidly: relief, anger, something parental and fierce, and then a kind of settling that was specific to people who have decided that whatever they feel personally is secondary to what needs doing right now. "Harry," he said. His voice was steady in the same way Ron's had been in the leaky cauldron the night before, controlled on the surface, not controlled underneath. "Ron told me." A pause. "All of it." "Good," Harry said. "I need you to know," Arthur stopped. Started again. "I have known Albus Dumbledore for 25 years. I have trusted him with my family's safety. I have defended his judgment to people who questioned it." He looked at Harry directly, and his eyes were very clear and very serious. "I am telling you that whatever you need from me to make this right, you have it. Completely and without reservation." Harry looked at him for a moment. The reintegrated instinct for reading people assessed Arthur Weasley in about 3 seconds and returned a verdict of, absolutely genuine, no strategic overlay. This is a man who's just moved from one position to another because the evidence demanded it and who will not move back regardless of social pressure. "Thank you," Harry said, and meant it at the depth it was offered at. "The Azkaban wards," Arthur said, moving immediately to practical. "I came because of that specifically. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement issued an emergency all-staff notification an hour ago. The wards are down and 3 prisoners have already. Is Sirius still in his cell?" Harry asked. Arthur looked at him. Something moved across his face. "You know about Sirius." "I know he's innocent. The evidence is in the Goblin records, the letter he left me, and also in the logic of the situation if anyone had ever examined it carefully." Harry kept his voice even. "Is he still in his cell?" "As of 40 minutes ago, yes. The Dementors are," Arthur's expression went complicated, "the Dementors are behaving unusually. The containment on them was also treaty-based, and without it," he paused, "they're not abusing the prisoners. They appear to be leaving. The Dementors are leaving Azkaban. The room absorbed that." "Dementors ran on treaty authority too," Hermione said, very quietly, mostly to herself, working through the implications. "They were bound to ministry service under a treaty provision that categorized them as under ministry jurisdiction," Ragnok said, who had clearly been following this conversation while simultaneously directing the controlled storm around the table. "Without that provision, they are free agents. Their behavior suggests they prefer to be elsewhere." "Where are they going?" Harry asked. "Unknown," Ragnok said. "It is not our most pressing concern." Harry looked at Arthur. "I need someone to go to Azkaban and get Sirius out of his cell before the Ministry sends people to lock it down again." Arthur Weasley looked at him steadily. "And if someone did that, what would be the legal basis?" "The charges against Sirius were never properly adjudicated, he never had a trial, which Ragnok's team has documented. The treaty void has created a legal liminal period in which charges filed under treaty-dependent law are technically in suspension. Which means that for the next," Harry looked at Ragnok. 72 hours, Ragnok said. 72 hours, the legal basis for Sirius's detention is compromised. Anyone releasing him now is technically acting in legal gray space rather than illegal space. Harry held Arthur's gaze. "And I would rather he be out and the legal argument be fought afterward than in and the window close." Arthur Weasley looked at Harry Potter and saw something he apparently found entirely convincing. He nodded once, turned to Ragnok. "I need whatever documentation you can give me to support that." "Already being prepared," Ragnok said, and one of the staff produced a folder on cue with the precision of someone who had anticipated this exact request. Arthur took the folder. He paused at the door. "Molly is going to want to see you," he said to Harry. When there's a moment. He found the word, she's processing. "I know," Harry said. "Tell her I'll come as soon as I can." Arthur went. Harry turned to Ragnok. The treaty meeting. Dumbledore and the Ministry, how far did they get? They reviewed the preliminary terms, Ragnok said. There was significant resistance to the signatory structure. The Ministry representative, a Madam Bones from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was more reasonable than expected. She asked intelligent questions. He paused. Dumbledore was quiet for most of the meeting. He read the terms carefully. He asked 2 questions. What questions? Ragnok's expression did the thing it did when something had impressed him. First, he asked whether the Void Clause had been triggered by Harry's explicit action or automatically by the ritual finding. I told him by explicit action. He nodded and said nothing more on that point. He looked at Harry. Second, he asked whether Sirius Black's instrument was on the record, and when I confirmed it was, he said, then the full picture is available to anyone who looks. And then he sat back and didn't speak again for 20 minutes. Harry thought about that. Dumbledore, understanding that the instrument's existence confirmed his actions, confirmed Sirius's innocence, confirmed the full shape of what had happened, and choosing not to fight it. Just sitting with it. Sitting in the discomfort, Harry thought. As requested. Where is he now? Harry asked. He requested a room. He's been in it for 2 hours. Ragnok paused. He asked to see you when you returned. He said, and I am quoting precisely, tell Harry I'll wait as long as he needs. Harry looked at the ceiling of the antechamber. He thought about 44 fractures and his mother at the river and Sirius writing a letter in October of 1981 knowing he was about to be taken to Azkaban. He thought about the cold patient rage from fracture 37, and how it had not gone away but had found its proper shape, not hot and consuming but clean and purposeful, a tool rather than a fire. Tell him I'll come in an hour, Harry said. I need to speak with the Fae and Dweller representatives by communication first, Ragnok, can we set up a channel? Already done, Ragnok said. And I need food, Harry added. It's been a very long day and it's only 2 in the afternoon. Hermione produced an apple from her bag and held it out without looking up from her notebook. Harry took it. He ate it standing, looking at the communication setup Ragnok's team was assembling, and thought about all the pieces of the world that needed fitting back together, and for the first time in his life the scale of a problem didn't make him feel small. It made him feel appropriately sized. Outside, Britain was reconfiguring itself, the Tide Watchers in the Thames, the Boundary Fae across the Highlands, the Deep Dwellers exhaling into their recovered moorland, the Dementors drifting away from Azkaban into an unbound wherever, and in a room in Gringotts somewhere, an old man with extraordinary blue eyes sitting with the full weight of what he'd done and waiting to be asked to account for it. Harry ate the apple. He looked at the work in front of him. He rolled up his sleeves. Right, he said. Let's keep going. Chapter 5, The Price of the Treaty. The room Ragnok had given Dumbledore was small and stone-walled and contained a chair, a table, a lamp, and nothing else that could be arranged or managed or used to establish the particular quality of controlled environment that Dumbledore had spent 60 years being very good at creating around himself. Harry suspected Ragnok had chosen it deliberately. He knocked once and went in without waiting for a response. Dumbledore was sitting in the chair with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance, which was in this case a stone wall approximately 4 feet away. He looked, Harry thought, genuinely old in a way he didn't usually, stripped of the setting, the desk, the half-moon glasses perched in the academic way, the office full of whirring instruments and portraits of predecessors lending institutional weight to everything he said. In a plain stone room with a single lamp he was just an old man sitting with something heavy. He looked up when Harry came in. The eyes were the same, extraordinary, that blue, even now, but they didn't do the thing they usually did, which was orient immediately toward management, toward the gentle construction of a dynamic that served his purposes. They just looked at Harry and waited. Harry pulled the table away from the wall, set it between them, and sat on it rather than bringing in another chair, which put him slightly higher than Dumbledore and which he did not do for that reason but which he noticed anyway. "You wanted to see me," Harry said. "I did." Dumbledore's voice was quieter than its usual register but entirely steady. Not the steadiness of composure performing itself, the steadiness of someone who has moved through the worst of a thing and come out the other side into a place of plain honesty. "I wanted to tell you something before the formal proceedings go any further. Not as a defense. Not as an explanation." He paused. "As an accounting." Harry looked at him and said nothing. "I knew your mother before the war," Dumbledore began. "You know this, in a general sense. But what I suspect you don't know, and what I should have told you years ago, is the specific nature of what Lily was working on in the last year of her life. What I knew about it. And what I decided to do about it." He unfolded his hands and looked at them for a moment. "Lily came to me in January of 1981 with her research. The knowledge transfer work. She was extraordinarily proud of it and rightly so. It was, by any measure, one of the most significant advances in hereditary magical theory in centuries." He paused. "She wanted my help refining the final stage. I was the most experienced magical theorist she knew and she trusted me." "You helped her," Harry said. "Not a question. I helped her. And while helping her I understood, fully, completely, and immediately, what the result would be. What you would be, if the transfer succeeded and you grew into it naturally." He met Harry's eyes. "Your mother was building a framework in you that would have produced, by the time you were an adult, something beyond a powerful wizard. It would have produced someone who could communicate with every major magical entity on this island, who had instinctive access to magical theory at the foundational level, who had the old political instincts of a lineage that predated the treaty and therefore predated every assumption the current magical world runs on." He paused. "And I saw that, and I thought about the prophecy, and I made a decision that I believed was necessary." "You decided I was too much," Harry said. "I decided you were too much of certain things and not enough of others," Dumbledore said. "And I was wrong. Not about what you were, about what to do with it." He held Harry's gaze. "I told myself I was protecting you from a burden too large for a child. I told myself a boy who knew his own power from infancy, who grew up speaking to ancient entities and understanding the deep grammar of magic, would become something ungovernable. Unreachable. That the prophecy required you to be human in a way that," he stopped. "That is where my reasoning breaks down, when I examine it honestly. Because what I actually feared was not that you'd be unreachable. It was that you'd be unmanageable. Those are not the same thing." The lamp on the wall threw steady light across the stone. Harry listened and did not fill the silence. "I was building a war," Dumbledore continued. "I had been building it since the prophecy was made, and I needed a weapon I could aim. A weapon that would go where I directed it, trust who I told it to trust, believe what I told it was true. A boy raised in the Muggle world, arriving at Hogwarts with no knowledge and no framework, dependent on the structures I'd put around him." He stopped again, with the expression of someone looking at their own handiwork from a distance and finding it uglier than expected. "A boy who loved his friends and trusted his headmaster and believed in the good of the wizarding world because I'd arranged for him to encounter that world in carefully controlled doses." He looked at Harry. "I took 44 pieces of you to build a weapon I was comfortable holding." The silence in the room was very full. "I know," Harry said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Because you deserve to hear it said plainly, by me, without qualifications." He paused. "I also need to tell you about your father." Harry went still in a way that was different from his other stillnesses. More alert. More careful. "James was not involved in the fractures," Dumbledore said. "I want to be clear about that. He didn't know. But James was involved in something else, a decision made in the summer of 1981, before your birth, that is part of why the situation became what it became. He reached into his robe and produced a folded document that he held without opening. The Potters were offered a choice, during the war. Their position as one of the 12 pre-treaty lineage families made them targets of particular interest to Voldemort, not just as obstacles but as assets. If he could bring a pre-treaty family to his side, or simply eliminate the lineage, it affected the magical political balance in ways most people at the time didn't understand. He set the document on the table. Voldemort made them an offer. Not the usual offer, not their lives for a step aside. A genuine offer of alliance. Harry looked at the document but didn't touch it. They refused. They refused immediately, without hesitation, and then James came to me. Dumbledore's voice was very level. He was frightened, and rightly so. He asked me what it meant that Voldemort considered the pre-treaty lineages valuable. I told him, and this is the part one regret most specifically, I told him a partial truth. He paused. I told him that the pre-treaty lineages had historical significance but that in the current war, what mattered most was keeping them out of Voldemort's hands. I didn't tell him about your mother's research. I didn't tell him that Lily had already come to me, that I understood exactly what you were going to be, that my plans for you were already forming. I let James believe the threat was about lineage politics and not about you personally. He looked at his hands. If I had been honest with James about what I intended, he would have stopped me. He was a fiercely intelligent man and he loved you absolutely and he would have seen through my justifications in approximately 30 seconds. He looked up. So I didn't give him the chance. Harry reached forward and took the document from the table. He unfolded it. It was a letter. James's handwriting, Harry had seen it before, in the old letters Sirius sometimes mentioned, in the parchment scraps that had come through various back channels over the years. Big, confident, slightly untidy, the handwriting of someone who wrote fast because their thinking outpaced their hand. Albus, following our conversation. Lily and I discussed it. We want full disclosure on all protective measures being taken for Harry. We want to know everything. She has a specific concern about the ritual work you mentioned, she wants to know the full scope before she agrees to anything. Please come in person. We need the honest version, not the version you've decided we can handle. James. Dated the 19th of October, 1981. 2 days before Sirius signed the instrument. 4 days before Godric's Hollow. James had known something was wrong. He'd written this letter and Dumbledore had gone to them and the next thing that happened in the record, 4 days later, was Voldemort at their door and the Fidelius betrayed and everything that followed. Harry refolded the letter carefully. He set it down. He knew you were hiding something, Harry said. He suspected. He was right to. Dumbledore's voice carried something Harry had never heard in it before, not guilt as a performance, not the managed sorrow of a man who felt bad about a decision he still secretly believed was right. Just the weight of it. The plain, unglamorous weight of having done wrong to someone who had trusted you and who had been too good at reading you and whose life had ended before he could prove he was right. I went to see them on the 20th. I told them, some of it. The protective measures. The blood wards. I was careful. I was very good at being careful. He stopped. On the 21st, Sirius filed the instrument at Gringotts. He told me afterward what he'd done. I was angry. I understood immediately what the instrument meant, that Sirius had found a way to guarantee your eventual reclamation that I couldn't control the timing of. I tried to file a counter-instrument. Ragnok's team blocked it. Harry looked at him. Ragnok knew. At the time. Ragnok has known since 1981 that something was wrong, Dumbledore said. He had no legal mechanism to act until the instrument triggered. But he preserved the record and he investigated and he waited. He made a small, dry sound that might have been respect. Goblins are extraordinarily patient when they are angry. Harry thought about Ragnok's amber eyes and the file of documentation that had clearly been years in the making and the prepared document that had been slid across the desk at precisely the right moment. Right, Harry said. He stood up from the table and walked to the wall and back, not from agitation but because he needed to be moving while he thought. The 44 pieces of himself arranged and rearranged around the information as it came in, integrating it, placing it. James writing that letter and knowing, with the instinct of a clever man who loved his wife and son, that something was being kept from him. Lily at the Thames speaking to the Tidewatchers. Sirius at Gringotts in the small hours, probably, filing an instrument with the focused desperation of someone doing the last thing they can think of to protect someone they love before everything falls apart. My parents, Harry said, still moving. What you took from them, they deserved to know what I was going to be. Yes, Dumbledore said simply. My father wrote you a letter asking for the honest version and you went and gave him a better crafted version of the careful version and 4 days later he was dead. Harry stopped. He said this without accusation in the hot sense. He said it the way you name the shape of a thing so it can be properly addressed. They died not knowing what I was. Not knowing what Lily had built into me. Not knowing that the protection they chose, the prophecy they were living inside, was also being managed by someone who decided their child needed to be less than he was. Yes, Dumbledore said. The same word. The same weight. Harry stood still. He thought about his father's letter in his hand, the handwriting that was confident and slightly untidy, the sentence we need the honest version, and he thought about the disc from his mother's box sitting in his chest giving him the feeling of her, and he thought about what he wanted to feel about all of it. What he found, underneath the cold precision of Fracture 37's anger, underneath the grief that had layers he was going to be finding for a long time, was something simpler and more durable. His parents had been extraordinary people. Brilliant, brave, loving, clear-eyed enough to know when they were being managed and principled enough to push back against it. They had been failed by someone they trusted and they had died in that failing, but the failing was not theirs. What they'd been was not diminished by what had been done around them. He had his mother in his chest and his father's letter in his hand and 44 pieces of himself finally in their right places, and the grief of it was real and large and was going to need substantial time and space, but it did not feel like destruction. It felt like ground. He turned back to Dumbledore. I'm going to ask you something, Harry said, and I want you to answer it without any of the management. Just directly. Dumbledore looked at him. All right. If you could go back to 1981 with everything you know now, with what you've seen today, what you've seen of what I can do, what you know the fractures cost, would you do it differently? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. The lamp held its steady light. Somewhere in the deeper part of Gringotts, a door closed with a resonant sound. I want to say yes, Dumbledore said finally. I want to say it clearly and convincingly. And I think the honest answer is that I don't know. Because the version of me in 1981 was absolutely certain he was right, and the mechanism that made him certain is the same mechanism I'm using now to assess whether he was. The confidence of my own judgment is the instrument that created this situation. I cannot fully trust it, and I do not know how to function without it. He paused. What I can tell you is that I believe I was wrong. I believe it simply and completely. And I believe that what you are, what your mother built and what you've recovered today, is not the threat I told myself it was. It's the only thing that has any real chance of making the new treaty work. He looked at Harry directly. You are the only person in this building, or possibly in Britain, who can speak to every party at that table. I know, Harry said. That's why the new treaty is going to work. He picked up his father's letter and held it. I'm keeping this. I brought it for you, Dumbledore said. I've had it for 15 years. I should have given it to you years ago. Harry put the letter in his inner pocket, next to the other letter, next to his mother's disc. He had both his parents there now, in whatever way they were available to be had. It was not what he would have chosen and it was what there was, and those two things were allowed to be true simultaneously. He went to the door. Then he stopped, because something else needed saying, and he wasn't going to leave it unsaid. The new treaty, he said without turning around. Ragnok wants me as the primary signatory. The goblins trust me and the old entities will negotiate with me. The ministry has no one better positioned for it right now, which they know, which is why Madam Bones has been cooperative. He paused. I'm going to need someone in the wizard community who people trust. Who has institutional knowledge. Who can be the bridge between the new terms and the existing ministry structures so that what we build actually holds. He turned around. I'm not forgiving you. I want to be clear about that. What you did doesn't have a forgiveness timeline I can offer you right now, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He held the older man's gaze. But I'm asking if you're willing to do the work. Not as the authority. As the person who knows where the bodies are buried and can help make sure the new structure doesn't repeat the old mistakes. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. His expression had moved through several things and arrived somewhere that was neither relief nor absolution, something more serious than either, and more earned. Yes, he said. I am willing. Good. Harry went through the door. The secondary vault was quieter the second time, without the weight of discovery. Harry went alone, which he'd told Ron and Hermione he needed to do, and they'd accepted it without argument, which was one of the things he loved most about them. He stood in front of the shelves and looked at his grandmother's research journals, 12 of them, the spines labeled in a precise hand with dates spanning 1952 to 1968, Doria Potter's years of ward theory work that the wizarding world had believed was lost. He ran his finger along the spines and felt the magic in them, old and careful and characteristically female in a way he wasn't sure how to articulate but that his instincts registered clearly. He pulled the first one. Doria Potter had been working on something that the mainstream ward theory community wouldn't have recognized, because she'd been working with a framework that predated the treaty, drawing on texts that weren't in the Hogwarts library or the ministry archives but that were in this vault, which suggested she'd had access to exactly these shelves and had been quietly developing a theoretical framework for magic that didn't depend on treaty provisions at all. Independent ward theory. Magic that didn't rely on the goblin infrastructure because it drew on something older, the land's own memory, the pre-treaty magical claims that the island carried in its geology, the agreements between the original magical entities that predated human settlement entirely. Harry sat down on the vault floor with the journal in his lap and read. She was brilliant. Methodical in a way that reminded him of Hermione and playful in her notation in a way that reminded him of nobody he'd met but felt entirely familiar. She worked through problems conversationally, her journals half research and half argument with herself, pushing back against her own conclusions with a rigor that made the conclusions more convincing when they held. She had been building something that the 1981 treaty structure had made unnecessary, or so everyone assumed. A backup system. A way toward Britain that didn't depend on the Goblin-Wizard partnership and didn't depend on the treaty remaining intact. Harry read for 40 minutes without stopping. Then he put the journal down and sat with the implications. His grandmother had known. Maybe not about the fractures, maybe not about Dumbledore's specific plan, but she had known, on some level, with the instinct of someone who understood the pre-treaty magical landscape better than anyone in the modern wizard world, that the treaty was fragile. That something built on a compact between parties with such a history of bad faith toward each other was a single crisis away from collapse. She had spent 17 years building a theoretical framework for what came next. And it was all here, in a vault that Dumbledore hadn't known about. Harry picked up the journal and held it and thought about the chain of it, Doria Potter building her theory in the 1950s and 60s, dying before she could publish or implement it, the journal sitting here in the sealed secondary vault. Lily Potter finding the Tide Watchers, building the knowledge framework into her infant son, creating the disc in the wooden box. Sirius Black filing the instrument in the last hours of his freedom. Ragnok building his investigation file over 14 years, waiting for the instrument to trigger. These people had built a path. Each of them, in the time they had, doing the piece they could reach, trusting that someone would eventually walk the path they'd made. They hadn't known it would be Harry, specifically, walking it in July of 1996 with all 44 pieces of himself finally in place. They just built it and left it and hoped. He sat in the vault and felt the weight of being loved by people across time, which was a specific kind of love that didn't have as much language around it as it deserved. He stood up. He gathered the 12 journals, tucked them under his arm, and went back up to the surface. Ron was in the antechamber with the expression of someone who had been given significant news and was managing it. He looked up when Harry came in. "Dad sent a message," he said. "Sirius is out." Harry sat down. The relief of it hit him differently than he expected, not explosive, not tearful, just a profound settling, a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged he was carrying releasing itself. He breathed out slowly. "Where is he?" "St. Mungo's." Ron paused carefully, "he's physically in bad shape. 12 years in Azkaban. But he's conscious and he's asking for you and he told Dad to tell you." Ron looked at a piece of paper, clearly reading a direct quote, "Tell him I want a full debrief and also someone needs to explain to me what century it is because the last thing I remember clearly is 1981. Harry laughed. It came out rough and genuine and entirely without performance. "That's serious," he said. "That is extremely serious," Ron agreed, and the corner of his mouth was doing something that it usually only did when he was genuinely happy. Hermione appeared in the doorway. She had the look of someone who had spent the past hour in a productive conversation and had information to dispense. "Ragnok's team has been in contact with the Centaur network," she said, coming in and sitting down with her notebook in one motion. "The Centaur's treaty provisions were about land rights and non-interference guarantees. Without the treaty those provisions are void, but the Centaurs sent a message." She looked up. "They said they've been watching the word breaker and they want to discuss the astronomical implications of the new treaty structure. Apparently there are star reading provisions they've wanted adjusted since 1100 AD. "The Centaurs," Ron said. "Star reading provisions. Of course. They also said," Hermione continued, and this is a direct quote from their message, "the young one moves as the stars said. We will attend the council." Harry absorbed this. The Centaurs attending the council voluntarily, without negotiation. He thought about Forenza and the things the Centaurs had said in the forest over the years, the slow deliberate weight of their pronouncements, and realized he'd been misreading them, not mystical rambling but actual astronomical data being poorly translated into a context that didn't have the right framework for it. "We need them at the table," Harry said. "Their star reading and the ward theory in these," he indicated the journals, "are going to intersect. My grandmother was working on something that I think the Centaurs understood long before any wizard did." Hermione looked at the journals with an expression of barely contained eagerness that she was making a valiant effort to keep professional. "Can I?" "Yes," Harry said, and handed her 3. "Start with 1958. That's where the independent ward theory begins." She took them with both hands, opened the first one, and was gone from the conversation in approximately 4 seconds. "Right," Ron said. "So. Where are we?" "We've got Sirius out of Azkaban, the Tide Watchers provisionally agreeing to negotiate, the Boundary Fae sending a representative, the Deep Dwellers provisionally agreeing, the Centaurs saying they'll attend, your grandmother's research that might solve the entire ward problem, Dumbledore being," he searched for the word, "chastened, I suppose. Madam Bones being unexpectedly reasonable." He paused. "What are we missing?" "The political problem," Harry said. "Fudge." Ron's expression confirmed this was the right call. "Yeah." Cornelius Fudge had been quiet during the morning meeting in a way that was not the quiet of someone listening and processing but the quiet of someone who had recognized they were in a situation they couldn't control and was waiting for it to resolve itself into something they could respond to. That kind of silence was temporary. As soon as Fudge felt the ground solidify under him again, the Ministry's instinct for self-preservation and jurisdiction would reassert itself, and the current cooperative window with Madam Bones would narrow. "What does Fudge actually need?" Hermione said, without looking up from the journal. "Political survival," Harry said immediately. "The ward's failing is a disaster he has no explanation for and no plan to address. His support base is dependent on the appearance that the Ministry has Britain's magical infrastructure under control. Right now that appearance is in ruins. He thought. If the new treaty works, if the wards are restored through a new framework that he can present as the ministry facilitating, he can reframe this as a historic renegotiation rather than a catastrophic failure. That requires him to give you the credit publicly while getting the benefit privately, Ron said. That is exactly the deal he'll want to make, Harry said. And I'll give it to him. Ron stared at him. You'll give Fudge the credit? I don't need the credit. I need the wards restored and the treaty to hold. If Fudge announcing it to the Daily Prophet is what makes it stick, then Fudge announcing it to the Daily Prophet is what happens. Harry shrugged. I'm not doing this to be famous. I'm already famous and it hasn't been particularly fun. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, you have genuinely changed. I've genuinely got back the parts of myself that were always there, Harry said. It looks like change from the outside. Ron considered this. Then he nodded, once, the deep nod that was his version of comprehensive agreement. Ragnok appeared in the doorway with the focused energy of someone moving between several large simultaneous problems. The Pennine situation has developed, he said. The Aurora office sent 2 teams to the Ribble Valley at noon. The Class 2 dwellers responded. He paused. No fatalities. But 3 Aurors are at St. Mungo's and the Wharf Valley has a significant portion of a hillside that is no longer where it was. They moved a hill. Ron said. A portion of one, Ragnok said. The dwellers were making a statement rather than attacking. The Aurors are going to want to go back in force. Harry stood up. No. Tell the ministry that the dwellers are under provisional treaty negotiation and any Auror action in the Ribble or Wharf Valleys constitutes interference with an active diplomatic process. He looked at Ragnok. Can Gringotts issue that notice? We can issue a legal hold notice that will take approximately 6 hours to be formally contested, Ragnok said. After which the ministry can challenge it, but the challenge will require a hearing, which requires scheduling, which buys time, Harry said. Buys time, Ragnok confirmed. 48 hours minimum. Issue it. Harry looked at Ron. I need to go to St. Mungo's. Sirius needs to know what's happening before the council convenes and I need him in a condition where he can be useful, because there are things about the pre-treaty Potter family history that are in his memory and nowhere else. Is he going to be in any condition to be useful? Ron asked, not unkindly. He's Sirius Black, Harry said. He spent 12 years in Azkaban staying sane enough to escape when he needed to. He'll be useful. Ron stood. Right. I'll come. I need you to do something else. Harry met his eyes. Go to your mum. Tell her everything, properly, from the start. She deserves the full version from someone who loves her, not a ministry memo or a Daily Prophet headline. Ron's face did the complicated thing again. She's going to cry. Probably. Then she's going to be furious. Definitely. Then she's going to want to feed everyone. That's actually useful, Harry said. Let her. We're going to need somewhere to work that isn't Gringotts, somewhere the ministry doesn't have eyes on, somewhere that's warded, he paused, or will be, once we sort the ward problem. The burrow has its own independent magic. Oldest part of the structure predates the treaty by 200 years according to your dad. Ron looked at him. You want to run the treaty council from the burrow. I want to have a base of operations that Fudge doesn't know about, Harry said. The formal council meeting can be at Gringotts. The actual working sessions, the getting things right sessions, should be somewhere I can think clearly and where the people I trust are. The corner of Ron's mouth did the thing again, larger this time. Mum is going to love this. I know, Harry said. That's also useful. St. Mungo's had lost its concealment wards with everything else, which meant it was currently sitting on the corner of its London Street in full visibility for the first time in several centuries, a fact that the hospital's administration was managing with the barely controlled emergency energy of people who had never imagined their primary problem would be Muggle passers-by stopping to read the sign. Hermione had sent a detailed memo from Gringotts that Harry suspected involved Ragnok's team applying a temporary glamour to the building's frontage, which bought them a day or two before the concealment became another crisis to manage. The ward Sirius was in was on the 4th floor. Harry took the stairs rather than the lift, which gave him the 45 seconds he needed to arrange himself, not suppress or manage, simply arrange, the way you arrange things for an important meeting. He knew the emotion was coming and he wasn't trying to stop it. He just wanted it to arrive in the right order. The healer outside the door was a young woman who looked at Harry with the particular combination of recognition and professional composure that people in caring professions developed when they encountered famous people in undignified circumstances. "He's been asking for you every 10 minutes, she said. "He's physically depleted, 12 years of dementor exposure and poor nutrition, but his magical core is intact and his mind is," she paused, "remarkably clear, actually. More than we'd expect." "He's stubborn," Harry said. "That explains a great deal," she said, and stood aside. Harry went in. Sirius was sitting up in the bed, which the healers had probably told him not to do and which he'd done anyway, and he was thinner than Harry had ever imagined anyone could be and still look fundamentally themselves. His face was hollowed and his hair was long and roughly cut and he was grey in places that were probably premature and his eyes were exactly what Harry had been given glimpses of across the past 3 years, that grey, that clarity, that intelligence that Azkaban had not touched. He looked at Harry coming through the door and his face did something that was not composure and not performance. It was just love, unmediated, looking at the person it had been looking for. "Merlin," Sirius said. His voice was rougher than Harry expected. "You're tall." Harry sat in the chair by the bed and looked at his godfather. "You're thinner than anyone should be. Hospital food is helping." Sirius was still looking at him with the same expression. "The ritual worked. The ritual worked. You got," he stopped. His voice caught slightly and then came back, controlled. "All of it? All 44. Harry paused. "I read your letter." Sirius breathed out slowly. "I wrote that with 3 hours to spare and I was not entirely calm when I wrote it." "It didn't read like panic," Harry said. "That's the Black family training for you. Look composed while falling apart." He looked at Harry steadily. "And the rest of it? Ragnok's team, the treaty void, the ancient entities, the whole," he gestured with one thin hand, "magnitude of everything." "We're partway through it," Harry said. "The Tide Watchers, the Boundary Fae, the Deep Dwellers, provisional agreements. The Pennine situation is under a legal hold. The Centaurs are coming to the Council voluntarily." He paused. "Dumbledore and I have talked." Sirius's expression went carefully controlled. "How was that?" "He was honest," Harry said. "More honest than I expected and I think more honest than he expected. He told me about my parents, about my father's letter. About what my mother built in me and why he sealed it." He held Sirius's gaze. "He told me James knew something was wrong." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "James knew," he said. "He didn't know specifically. But he felt it. You know how James was, he had this absolute nose for when someone was being clever in the wrong direction. He wrote that letter and he was going to push harder, he told me that. He was going to go back to Albus and not leave until he had the full picture." A pause. "He didn't get the chance." Harry sat with that. "Did you know about my mum's research? The knowledge transfer?" "Lily told me some of it. Not the technical details, she said the theory was complicated and she didn't want to give me an incomplete version, but she was excited about it. Really excited, which with Lily meant she'd walk into walls because she was still thinking about it even while she was doing other things." Something in his voice went warm and raw simultaneously. "She said she was giving you a head start. That you were going to need one, given what was coming, and she wasn't going to send you in empty-handed." He paused. "I think she knew, on some level, that she might not make it. That the war was going to take one of them or both of them. She was building you things that would last past her. Harry put his hand in his inner pocket and touched the disc without taking it out. The warmth came through the fabric. She got there, he said. Sirius looked at his face. Yeah, he said quietly. She did. They sat in the hospital room for a while without talking, which didn't feel like silence but like something else, the kind of presence that didn't need filling. Outside the window London went about itself in its ordinary way, and somewhere beneath the city the tide watchers moved in the river they'd been returned to, and across Scotland the boundary fae walked ground they hadn't touched in 1,000 years, and in the moorland above the Ribble Valley something ancient breathed the fresh air of its recovered territory with the deep patience of things that had been waiting long enough to understand that patience was not the same as surrender. Eventually Sirius said, "The council. When are you calling it?" 2 days, Harry said. I need the ward theory from my grandmother's journals translated into a workable framework. Hermione's on that now and she's the right person for it. I need the boundary fae representative to have time to consult with the wider fae community. And I need, he paused, I need you there. Sirius looked at him. I'm not going to be much physical use. Not yet. I don't need physical use, Harry said. I need you at the table. As the person who was there in 1981, who understands what the old treaty did wrong from the inside, who was a prisoner of a system built on that treaty's foundations. He held his godfather's gaze. I need people to see that the treaty void has a human cost that isn't just political. And I need you next to me because, he stopped, found the honest version, because you're the only person in that room who knew both my parents and who is going to be there not because of the politics or the magic or the legal implications, but because you love me. Sirius was quiet for a long moment. I'll be there, he said. Good. Harry stood. Rest. Eat the hospital food even if it's terrible. I'll be back tomorrow. He went to the door. Then he stopped, because stopping at doors was apparently his mode of delivering final important things today. Sirius, he said, not turning around. Yeah. The letter. You wrote, be magnificent. He paused. I'm working on it. He heard Sirius's voice behind him, rough and warm and 12 years worth of missing and finding all in one, Harry. You're already there. Harry went through the door and down the corridor and out into the London afternoon, where the sky was doing the complicated thing London skies did at the end of long days, and he walked north along the embankment with his parents in his pocket and his godfather at his back and 44 pieces of himself finally assembled, and thought about what came next. What came next was the council. What came next was the new treaty. What came next was the work his mother and grandmother and godfather and all the people who'd built the path before him had been reaching toward. He was going to call every faction to the table and he was going to build something that held, not because it was imposed from above but because everyone at the table had shaped it. The Thames moved beside him. Below its surface, something very old and very patient felt the vibration of his footsteps and knew who he was, and in the deep water language that had no exact human translation, sent upward the impression of something that wasn't quite a greeting and wasn't quite a blessing but was in the same family as both. Harry felt it in the soles of his feet and kept walking. Chapter 6, rewritten. The burrow at 6 in the morning was the same as it had always been, improbable, warm, slightly leaning in a direction that geometry disapproved of, smelling of bread and garden and the particular magical domestic smell that came from decades of a family doing everything with a little extra enchantment because it was simply more interesting that way. The kitchen clock still had a hand for each Weasley, though now it had acquired, sometime overnight, a 9th hand labeled Harry and Molly Weasley's handwriting, which had been added with the decisive energy of someone who had processed their feelings and arrived at action. Harry noticed it when he came downstairs at 6:15 and didn't say anything about it because there wasn't anything to say that would improve on the fact of it. Molly was already at the stove. She'd been told the full version by Ron the previous evening, Harry knew because Arthur had sent a brief message that said simply, she knows. She cried. She's angry. She's making soup. Come when you're ready. Harry had arrived at 10 the previous night to find the kitchen full of the very specific industrious energy of Molly Weasley channeling difficult emotions into cooking, which had produced 3 different types of soup, 2 loaves of bread, and a casserole that nobody had asked for but that everyone was going to eat. She turned when he came in. Her eyes were clear and her face was composed in the way it got when she'd finished the emotional part of something and moved into the determined part. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that took inventory, that assessed, that decided something, and then she crossed the kitchen and hugged him with the comprehensive force that was her specific register of love, which was different from a polite hug in the way that a thunderstorm is different from a drizzle. Harry hugged her back without stiffening or managing it, which was also new, or rather was the old version of himself restored, the part that could receive love without immediately calculating what it meant or whether it was safe. She pulled back. Looked at him again. "Sit down," she said. "Eat something before the world falls on you." He sat. She put food in front of him with the efficiency of long practice and then sat across from him with her hands around a cup of tea and her eyes direct. "I knew something wasn't right," she said. "Not specifically. But I've been watching you for 5 years and there were," she paused, looking for the word, "gaps. Places where a boy your age with your history should have felt a certain way and you felt something adjacent to it but not quite right. I thought it was trauma. I told myself it was the Dursleys and Voldemort and the weight of the prophecy." She shook her head. "It never occurred to me to question the framework I'd been given for understanding you." "Nobody questioned it," Harry said. "That was the design. That doesn't make me feel better about it." Her voice was firm. "But I appreciate you saying it." She looked at him with the steady directness of someone who did not do things halfway. "What do you need from this house?" "From us?" "The Burrow's old magic," Harry said. "The pre-treaty structure in the oldest part of the house. I need it as a foundation while I work on the independent ward framework from my grandmother's research. Gringotts is the right place for the formal proceedings, but the working sessions need to happen here." "Then they happen here," she said, as simply as if he'd asked to borrow a book. "There will be," he paused, thinking about how to introduce this, non-human guests. "Representatives from the Fae, the Dwellers, potentially the Centaurs. This kitchen is going to be, Harry." She looked at him with the patience of someone who has raised 7 children through a war. "I have made breakfast for a house elf, a werewolf, a dozen order members, and an enchanted clock that kept telling me Arthur was at mortal peril while he was in the bathroom. I can manage ancient magical entities." Harry looked at her. "Do you know," he said, "I think you probably can." Something crossed her face that was very close to a smile. Then she stood up, refilled his tea, and went back to the stove with the air of a general resuming command of a campaign that was, at last, going the right way. By 8 o'clock the kitchen table had transformed into something between a war room and a research library. Hermione had arrived at 7:30 with the 12 journals and 3 of her own books and a list of 17 questions about Doria Potter's methodology that she'd been writing since 4 in the morning based on context clues in what she'd read the previous day. She and Harry worked through the journals side by side while Arthur sat at the end of the table going through the ministry's internal communications with the focused expression of someone identifying exactly which parts of an institution were functional and which were actively making things worse. Ron appeared at 8:15, ate half a loaf of bread standing at the counter, looked at the table, and said, "Right. What do I do?" "You know the Muggle studies reading you've been avoiding?" Harry said without looking up. Ron stopped. "Yeah. The Boundary Fae have been watching human communities for 11 centuries. Their representative is going to reference things from Muggle history and expect to be understood. I need someone at the council table who isn't going to blank when they do." Ron sat down, picked up Hermione's copy of A Social History of Magical Britain which included extensive Muggle parallel history, and started reading with the resigned determination of someone who has accepted a task they didn't choose but will execute properly because it matters. At 9, Ragnok arrived via a method that was apparently a goblin transportation system Harry hadn't known existed, stepping out of what looked like the surface of the kitchen wall with the composure of someone for whom this was entirely standard, carrying 3 rolls of document under one arm and a communication stone in his other hand. He looked at the table, at the journal spread across it, at the map of Britain that Arthur had pinned to the wall with locations marked, and sat down at the remaining chair with the air of someone who had come to work. "The legal hold on the Pennine situation holds for 31 more hours," he said. "The ministry's challenge filing was submitted at 7 this morning, which means the hearing is earliest day after tomorrow. By which point the council will have convened and the new framework will be in place, making the challenge moot." He set the documents down. "Madam Bones has been helpful. She sent me a private message this morning indicating that she is aware the legal hold is a delaying tactic, that she considers it a legitimate one given the circumstances, and that she will ensure the challenge proceeds at the slowest legally acceptable pace." "I like Madam Bones," Hermione said, still reading. "She is considerably more useful than most of her colleagues," Ragnok agreed. "What about Fudge?" Harry asked. "The minister has been in an emergency session of the Gringotts since 7:30, presenting the situation as a," Ragnok consulted his notes, "extraordinary diplomatic opportunity arising from a complex historical misalignment in treaty provisions." Ron looked up from his book. "He's already reframing it. He reframed it around 2 in the morning when it became clear the goblins weren't going to be publicly blamed," Ragnok said. "He is now the minister who facilitated the most significant magical diplomatic breakthrough in a millennium." He looked at Harry. "As you predicted." "Good," Harry said. "Let him have it." The morning moved fast after that in the way mornings moved when the work was real and everyone doing it was focused. Hermione cracked the theoretical core of Doria Potter's independent ward framework by 10:15, which she announced by standing up and saying "oh" in a very quiet voice and then sitting back down and writing for 4 minutes straight without looking up. When she finally looked up she said, "Your grandmother was working on something that the mainstream magical community missed completely because they assumed the treaty infrastructure was permanent. She identified 11 independent magical anchors in the British landscape, features that predate human habitation and carry their own magical authority regardless of any treaty, and she theorized that a ward network anchored to those 11 points would be as robust as the treaty-based system and entirely self-sustaining." 11 anchors, Harry said. "What are they?" She listed them. Harry listened and his instincts assembled the geography: 3 in Scotland, 2 in Wales, 1 in Cornwall, 3 in the Midlands and North, 2 in East Anglia. Old places. Places where the pre-human magic was thickest, where the treaty boundaries had always been drawn around rather than through because even the original treaty negotiators had understood they were different. "Stonehenge," Harry said. "That's the Cornwall one." "The Cornwall one," Hermione confirmed. "The Tide Watchers will know the East Anglian anchors," he said. "The Boundary Fae hold 2 of the Scottish ones. The Deep Dwellers are sitting on at least one of the northern ones." He looked at the map. "We need all of them. Every faction at the table controls at least one anchor point. My grandmother built a treaty framework that requires everyone to be in it." The table went quiet. Arthur lowered the ministry communication he'd been reading. Ragnok set down his quill. Ron looked up from the Muggle history. Hermione sat back in her chair. Harry looked at the map of Britain with the 11 marked points and felt the shape of what his grandmother had been building click into its full dimension, not just a theoretical framework, not just a backup ward system, but a structural guarantee that the magical community could never again be secured by a single faction's infrastructure. The ward system and the political system would be the same system. You couldn't maintain the wards without the cooperation of every party, which meant you couldn't maintain the wards without maintaining the relationship. It was, in the clearest possible sense, a system designed so that nobody could do what had been done to the Treaty of 872, corner the infrastructure, control the access, and thereby control everyone who depended on it. "She was building this for the long term," Harry said quietly. "She was building this for you," Hermione said. "I don't think she knew it, specifically. But she was building it for whoever came after who would need it." Harry looked at the map for another moment. Then he picked up his quill. "Let's get the council documents drafted." The council convened at Gringotts the following morning at 10 o'clock, in a chamber Harry hadn't been in before, larger than the meeting room of the previous days, large enough to hold the kind of table that the situation required, which was a table where nobody sat at the head because that had been Ragnok's first and entirely non-negotiable contribution to the planning. Round, iron, very old, clearly pre-treaty in origin. It had been brought up from the deep storage of Gringotts' own vault archive and set in the center of the chamber with the deliberate precision of a statement. Harry arrived early and stood at the entrance and watched the chamber fill. The Tide Watcher representative came first, the eldest, who had surfaced in the Thames 3 days ago, now in a form more suited to extended above-water presence, still unmistakably itself, still carrying that quality of geological patience. It moved to a chair at the table and settled into it with the unhurried certainty of something that had been waiting 11 centuries for this particular morning and intended to be present for every minute of it. The Boundary Fae representative arrived next, the one from the Highland hillside, with the too symmetrical face and the changing eyes, accompanied by a second Fae that Harry hadn't met, older than the first, carrying the weight of longer memory. They took adjacent seats and looked around the chamber with the evaluating attention of people assessing a room they'd never been in and deciding whether its arrangements met their standards. The Deep Dweller representative was a surprise. Harry had half expected some version of the ground communication, a presence rather than a body, but what arrived was a figure of compact solidity, grey-brown as the moorland stone, with the same quality of compressed time in its face that all the ancient entities seemed to share. It moved carefully in the above-ground air, deliberately, the way someone moves in an unfamiliar medium, and took its seat with a dignity that made the carefulness irrelevant. The Centaur delegation was 3 strong, Megorian, whom Harry recognized from the forest, and 2 others he hadn't met. They stood rather than sat, which Ragnok had apparently anticipated because there were 3 spaces at the table without chairs. Megorian looked at Harry as he entered and gave the small deliberate nod that centaurs reserved for occasions where human gesture was appropriate, which was not often and therefore meant something when it happened. On the wizard side, Ragnok at the table as the Goblin representative and organizing authority. Harry beside him. Hermione beside Harry with 3 notebooks and the expression of someone about to live the most important moment of her academic life. Sirius, pale and too thin and absolutely present, sitting straight with the determined look of someone running on willpower and the knowledge that this mattered. Arthur Weasley in his ministry capacity, which he told Fudge was a routine liaison meeting and which was something considerably more significant than that. Dumbledore, at the table's edge, in the position Harry had described to him, not authority, not absent, but present and accountable. And then Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who had arrived uninvited and sat down with the air of someone who was there and intended to remain there. Harry had looked at her when she sat and she'd looked back with the expression of someone who had decided which side of history they were on and had pulled up a chair. Director Ragnok, Harry said, standing. We can begin. Ragnok opened the session with the Goblin legal formula that formally constituted the Council as a treaty negotiating body under pre-existing magical law, older than the 872 treaty, a form that predated most of the institutional structures in the room and that lent the proceedings an authority that nobody at the table was going to question, because the authority wasn't derived from any of them. Then Harry spoke. He didn't use notes. He stood at the round table with every faction looking at him and talked about what the old treaty had done wrong, not in the emotional register, not as grievance, but as structural analysis. The 872 treaty had concentrated infrastructure in a single partnership and used that concentration to control every other magical community on the island. It had contained ancient entities not through negotiation but through leverage. It had made protection conditional on compliance. It had, in one specific case that Harry named plainly and without drama, been used as the legal vehicle for an act of profound personal violation committed on a child, which had triggered the void clause and brought them to this room. He named what needed to be different. Not what he wanted, what the structure required, based on his grandmother's framework, based on 3 days of conversation with the parties in this room, based on what the land itself told him when he listened to it. 11 anchor points. 11 parties in common stewardship. A ward network that existed because every party maintained their anchor, which meant every party's participation was not charity or tolerance but necessity. A governance structure that required consensus on any changes to the framework, not ministry consensus, not Goblin consensus, but the consensus of everyone at the table, which meant everyone at the table had veto power and everyone at the table had responsibility. When he finished, the room was quiet. The eldest Tide Watcher was the first to respond, in the deep-water language, which Harry translated. The East Anglian anchor points are under the sea in our territory. We accept stewardship. The Boundary Fae representative said, in its multidimensional voice, 2 of the Scottish anchors are in our ancestral territory. We accept stewardship, contingent on the formal acknowledgement filed yesterday being incorporated into the treaty text. It looked at Harry. Which we understand it has been. It has, Ragnok confirmed. The Deep Dweller representative placed a broad grey hand on the table. In the channel between the surface and whatever lived below it, Harry felt the confirmation, the Northern Midlands anchor was in Dweller territory. They accepted. Megorian, standing with the other centaurs, said, the Welsh anchor and one of the Midland anchors are on Centaur astronomical lines. We have maintained them for 4,000 years without recognition or agreement. We accept formal stewardship. He paused with the centaur's characteristic quality of speaking to a slightly longer timescale than the current conversation. The stars have been pointing at this morning since before any of us were born. Arthur Weasley said, speaking for the ministry accepts stewardship of the 2 English lowland anchors. And, he paused, looking at the document in front of him with the careful expression of a man reading something very carefully. On behalf of the ministry, I want to formally acknowledge the governance failures that contributed to the conditions leading to this council. The ministry should have known. We should have looked harder. We didn't. He folded his hands. We are here to do better. It wasn't eloquent. It was Arthur Weasley, which was better than eloquent. Harry looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back at him steadily. He hadn't been assigned a stewardship role in the framework. What Harry had asked of him was different. He stood up from his chair at the table's edge and addressed the room in a voice that had none of its usual orchestrated weight and was considerably more powerful for the absence. I have been asked to formally state, for the treaty record, the events of October 1981 and my role in them. He looked at the room, at the ancient entities, at the goblins, at the ministry representatives, at Harry. I performed 44 deliberate magical fractures on Harry Potter between 1981 and the night of October 31st of that year, without the consent of himself, his parents, or any other party. I did this using Goblin ritual infrastructure to which I had legal access and which I used without disclosing my purpose. I believed my reasons were sufficient. They were not. A pause. I am making this statement without qualification or caveat. The record should show it plainly. He sat back down. The room was very quiet. Then Ragnok said, into the quiet, the statement is entered into the treaty record. And with that plain, unglamorous accountability, the room moved forward. The treaty negotiations took 6 hours. Harry had expected longer, had prepared himself for the slow friction of competing interests meeting in formal space, but what happened instead was something he'd learned to recognize in the past 4 days, when people had been genuinely heard, when their grievances had been acknowledged rather than managed, the practical work moved at a different pace. Not without difficulty, there were 3 points of significant disagreement, 2 on territorial definition and 1 on the governance voting structure that took 90 minutes alone. But the difficulty was the productive kind, the kind that came from everyone caring about the outcome rather than the kind that came from nobody trusting the process. The territorial disagreements were resolved by going to the land. Literally, Harry put his hand on the iron table and reached down through the Gringotts stonework into the deep geological record and asked the Tidewatcher representative to do the same through the water channels, and the 2 of them cross-referenced the boundary line the old way, through the material record of the land itself rather than through any map drawn by people who'd had reasons to draw it favorably. The Fey representative watched this with the changing eyes and said, afterward, we would not have believed a wizard could do that, and Harry said, I've had some unusual help, and glanced at Sirius, who raised an eyebrow. The voting structure was harder. The centaurs wanted astronomical cycles incorporated into the governance calendar, decisions affecting the full network to be confirmed at specific stellar alignments, which Hermione quickly showed were actually mathematically sound decision timing windows rather than mysticism. The ministry representatives were skeptical, until Arthur pointed out that the Wisingamot already operated on a lunar calendar for certain votes, which was the same principle. The skepticism downgraded to reluctant acceptance, which was sufficient. At 4 in the afternoon, Ragnok set down his quill and looked at the document in front of him. The Treaty of 11 Anchors, he said, with the formality of naming something into existence. First draft, complete and ready for review. Nobody spoke for a moment. Harry looked at the document, thick, annotated, in 5 languages, bearing the marks and impressions of 7 contributing parties, and felt something in his chest complete itself the way the ritual had completed, not explosively but with the deep click of a thing finding its right shape. Review it, he said. Take the evening. Anyone with changes, back to Ragnok by 9 tomorrow morning. Signing is at noon. The signing the next day took 20 minutes, which was about right. Treaties that have been genuinely agreed don't need ceremony. The ceremony is for things that need the appearance of consensus rather than the substance of it. What happened at noon in the Gringotts chamber was 11 parties pressing their marks into a document and meaning it, which was a different thing entirely from performance. Harry signed last, as the primary wizard signatory, which was the position Ragnok had designated and which Harry had accepted not for the status of it but because someone had to, and it should be someone who understood what they were signing. He pressed his palm to the page and felt his magical signature enter the document and felt the document acknowledge it, not magically in the showy sense, but in the old sense, the way things that are genuinely worded recognize genuinely intended magic. He lifted his hand. The document sealed itself. In the deep stone of Gringotts' foundation, something shifted. Not catastrophically, not like the ward collapse 3 days ago, which had been felt in teeth and spine. This was the opposite of collapse. A settling. A returning of weight to its proper distribution. Harry felt it through his feet and looked up and saw the Tidewatcher representative's broad face change, and saw the boundary phase eyes do something that had nothing to do with the color shift, and saw the Deep Dweller put its hand flat on the table with an expression of recognition. The anchor points are responding, Hermione said quietly, her hand on the table beside Harry, feeling it too through the old language instinct she'd been developing, he'd noticed, in the past 3 days, growing into a sensitivity that hadn't been there before. The framework is taking hold. How long until the ward network is fully operational? Harry asked Ragnok. The independent ward network needs each steward to perform the anchor activation in their territory, Ragnok said. 48 to 72 hours for all 11 anchors. The Ministry's detection concealment will be the last to restore, because it's the most complex. He looked at Harry. The island will have some degree of exposure for another 2 to 3 days. We can manage that, Harry said. We have managed it for 3 days already, Ragnok said. Britain has not ended. Britain has not ended, Harry agreed. Fudge, who had arrived at noon with a press secretary and a prepared statement, spent approximately 30 seconds looking at the signed document and then turned to his press secretary and began revising the statement with the instinctive speed of a political survivor who recognized a winning position when the landscape shifted to reveal one. Harry watched him for a moment, felt nothing in particular about it, and turned away. Sirius was across the room talking to Arthur Weasley with the focused energy of someone making up for 12 years of missed conversations at speed. He looked, Harry thought, fractionally less hollowed than he had at St. Mungo's, still thin, still grey in places it shouldn't be, still carrying the physical evidence of what Azkaban had done, but with a quality of presence that was filling back and around the edges, returning from wherever it had been pressed down to. He caught Harry looking and raised an eyebrow that meant, "We'll talk later." Harry nodded. McGonagall appeared at his elbow with the characteristic directness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Professor. What you accomplished this week." She stopped. Recalibrated. "You didn't need a great deal of help, in the end." "I needed a great deal of help," Harry said. Just from a different direction than expected. She looked at him with the clear eyes that had been looking at him since he was 11 and making the same precise assessment every time. Who are you? What are you made of? What will you do with it? I should have looked harder, she said again. The same words as in the meeting room. But this time they had the quality of something settled rather than something confessed. I won't miss it again. I know you won't, Harry said. She nodded once, the McGonagall nod, which was one of the more definitive things in the known world, and moved away. Hermione was at his other side. She had all 3 notebooks closed and tucked under her arm, which was how he knew she'd finished processing. When Hermione was actively thinking, the notebooks were open. When they were closed, she'd arrived somewhere. Doria Potter's journals, she said. The theoretical framework, it's not complete. She stopped in 1968 and there are 3 open questions she was working toward that she didn't resolve. She looked at him. I want to finish it. The full theoretical publication, properly attributed. Doria Potter's work should be in the academic literature. Do it, Harry said immediately. It might take a year. There are implications that extend beyond the ward framework, into hereditary magical theory, into entity relations, into, Hermione, Harry said. Do it. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was doing the calculation between what she wanted and what she was allowed to want. Then she let the calculation go. All right, she said. Yes. And the smile that followed was the real one, the one that didn't happen often enough. Ron appeared from the direction of the food that Ragnok's staff had produced for the post-signing, carrying plates for both of them with the navigational ease of someone who had spent years acquiring food at crowded Hogwarts tables. He handed one to Hermione, one to Harry, kept nothing for himself, and then looked mildly accusatory when they both looked at him. I already ate, he said. Go on, eat. This is the treaty you can eat, not the one on the table. Harry ate. Across the room the Centaur delegation was in discussion with the Boundary Fae representative, the Centaurs explaining something astronomical, the Fae listening with the focused attention of something very old encountering a compatible intelligence. The Tide Watcher had gone back to the river now that the signing was done, but its mark was on the document and the Thames above Southwark was running clean and clear and carrying something in its current that Harry could feel from here as a rightness. The Deep Dweller representative caught his eye from across the room and made a gesture Harry recognized from their communication 3 days ago, the impression of acknowledgement, of debt settled. Not gratitude exactly, more like the moment when a weight that has been shared is finally distributed correctly. Harry returned the gesture, the one he developed through the old language, and watched the Dweller's broad face do the thing that very ancient things' faces did when they encountered something unexpected in the right direction. He left Gringotts at 5 in the afternoon, which was when the last of the formal proceedings concluded and the parties dispersed in their various directions. Ragnok saw him to the door personally, which was not a thing Ragnok did for wizards as a category and which felt significant without requiring acknowledgement. At the door, Ragnok said, the treaty will hold. I think so, Harry said. Not hoping. Thinking. Ragnok looked at him. You are certain. The structure is right, Harry said. No single party can break it without breaking themselves, because the wards require every anchor. My grandmother designed it that way. All I did was get everyone to the table. You did considerably more than that, Ragnok said. I'll accept considerably more, Harry said. Just not everything. Ragnok's face did the amber-eyed thing that was the Goblin's version of comprehensive respect. Mr. Potter, he said. It has been, a pause, the considered pause of a very precise creature finding the exact word, remarkable. For me too, Harry said. He stepped out into Diagon Alley. The evening was doing the London summer thing of being warm in a way that felt earned, the light going gold and generous across the white marble of the bank face, the ordinary magical afternoon of the alley going about itself, people with shopping, owls, the smell of Florian Fortescues, kids dragging their parents. Harry stood on the steps for a moment and looked at it. 3 days ago, the concealment wards on all of this had failed. For 3 days, this alley had sat behind a Gringotts glamour, visible at its edges to muggle passers-by, and the world had not ended. The sky had not fallen. What had happened instead was that 11 parties had sat at a round iron table and agreed on something that was going to last considerably longer than the arrangement it replaced. He went down the steps and walked north. The leaky cauldron was quiet at this hour, Tom doing his evening cleaning, a couple of witches in the corner with drinks, no particular drama. Harry sat at the bar and ordered a butterbeer and thought about nothing specific for about 20 minutes, which was the first 20 minutes of nothing specific he'd had since Tuesday. He thought about Tuesday. The letter, the mail slot, the flat grey morning light at Privet Drive. The person he'd been when he picked up that bronze envelope, the 43% version, the one who had spent 6 years slightly out of step with himself, who had felt every gap in his understanding as a personal failure rather than a structural one. Who had deferred and managed and performed the version of Harry Potter that the structures around him had shaped. He thought about who he was now. Not a weapon. Not a symbol. Not the chosen one or the boy who lived or the ward breaker or any of the other labels that had been stuck to him over the years, all of which described real things about him and none of which were sufficient. He was a 16-year-old wizard who could speak to ancient entities in a language older than words, who had his mother's warmth in his chest and his father's stubbornness in his spine and 44 pieces of himself finally assembled, who had walked into a Goblin bank on a Tuesday and come out on a Friday having rewritten the foundational treaty of magical Britain. He was Harry. That turned out to be enough. More than enough. His butterbeer was empty. He set it down. There was still a great deal to do, Voldemort was still out there, the war was still building, Sirius needed time and care, the Hogwarts situation needed addressing, his own education needed significant revision given that he'd been receiving it with less than half his capability. There were anchor activations to coordinate, ward network tests to run, the formal publication of Doria Potter's work, the political fallout from Fudge's public reframing to manage, whatever the Daily Prophet was going to do with the story of the century once the full picture became available, which it would. There was, in other words, plenty. The horizon was full of it. He stood up. He left a few nuts on the bar. He tapped through the wall to the alley and walked out into the London evening with the particular quality of forward motion that belongs to people who know exactly who they are. Behind him, in the stone streets of Diagon Alley, the glamour over the alley entrance was still holding. Above him, the sky was doing the evening's best work, that specific blue that deepened toward purple over London rooftops, the first stars finding their way through. In a moorland above the Ribble Valley, the Deep Dweller representative was performing the first of the anchor activations, pressing ancient hands into ancient stone and beginning the work of building wards from the inside out. In the Thames, the Tidewatcher was moving through the clean water of its return territory and preparing to reach the East Anglian coast. In the Highlands, for Boundary Fae were standing at the first Scottish anchor point, hands pressed together in the formation the treaty specified, beginning their activation. Across Britain, 11 points of old deep magic were waking up, acknowledging each other across the geological record, beginning the slow powerful conversation that would build the new ward network from the ground up. Not imposed. Not leveraged. Built together, by everyone who lived under it, with the full knowledge of what they were building and why. Harry felt it in his feet. The slight warm vibration of the earth beginning to do its work. He felt it through the channel his mother had opened, through the grammar she built into his bones before he was born, through the 44 pieces of himself finally assembled and finally, comprehensively, his. He smiled. Not for anyone watching. Just because the evening was warm and the ground was waking up and he was, for the first time in his life, entirely himself. He walked north through London and the city moved around him with its ordinary thunder and light and the world, which was not fixed and not finished but was pointed in a better direction than it had been on Tuesday, went about its business under the deepening sky. 11 anchors. 1 framework. 1 treaty written not on domination or leverage or the managed ignorance of a boy with most of himself sealed away, but on the plain fact of everyone at the table meaning it. The first stars were out properly now. Somewhere above the city, the centaurs would be reading them, The long star paths that Megorian had said pointed at this morning since before anyone in that council chamber had been born, the astronomical lines converging on a round iron table in a goblin bank where nobody sat at the head because that had been the first and most important decision. Harry walked on. The city held him in its ordinary arms. The ground hummed beneath his feet. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was his.